The scream tore through the training grounds before Elena even realized she had made a sound. Her wrist bent at an angle it was never meant to bend, and the wooden staff she had been holding rolled away into the dirt. Around her, a dozen warriors froze mid-motion, but only one pair of eyes mattered, and those eyes belonged to the last person on earth she wanted to see her fall. King Damien Ashford did not rush toward the noise like everyone else. He walked, slow and deliberate, the way he did everything, as if the world owed him the patience to arrive exactly when he chose. When he reached her, he crouched down, took her wrist in his hand without asking permission, and turned it gently to the side. "You pushed off the wrong foot," he said, his voice flat, almost bored. "Wrap it and rest it for 3 days." Then he stood, turned, and walked away, already speaking to his second-in-command about supply routes for the eastern border. He did not look back. He never looked back at her, not once, not in 10 years. Elena sat in the dirt, cradling her wrist, and let herself feel the full weight of something she had known for a long time but never said out loud, not even inside her own head. She loved a man who did not know she existed except as a body that occasionally got in his way. That night, she sat on the low stone wall behind the training barracks, wrist wrapped in cloth, watching the lights of the main hall flicker through tall windows. Somewhere in there, Damien was meeting with his council, discussing borders and treaties and the endless business of running a kingdom that stretched from the northern pine forests to the salt marshes in the south. Somewhere in there, he was being a king. Out here, she was being nothing at all, just a shape in the dark, watching a light she could never step into. Elena had grown up in the lower quarter of the Packlands, the daughter of a blacksmith and a healer, in a house with a crooked roof and warm bread every morning. She had known Damien since she was 6 years old, when he was a boy of 8 with serious eyes, and a way of standing very still that made grown warriors quiet down without him saying a word. Even then, he had carried something heavy. His mother had died giving birth to a stillborn sister, and his father, the old king, had grown cold and distant afterward, pouring all his attention into shaping his son into a ruler rather than raising a child. Elena remembered the first time she had truly seen him, not as the future king but as a person. She had been 10, hiding behind a hay bale during a summer festival, avoiding a group of older children who liked to tease her about her patched dresses. Damien had found her there, said nothing about her hiding, and simply sat down beside her with a piece of honey bread he had stolen from the feast table. They did not talk much. He just handed her half the bread and stared out at the fireflies rising over the field. It was the only unguarded moment she had ever seen from him, and she had held on to it for years, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone, wondering if he even remembered it at all. He did not. She was almost certain of that now. To him, she was a soldier who trained hard, followed orders well, and occasionally injured herself doing something reckless. To her, he was every quiet hope she had never allowed herself to speak aloud. Sophie found her on the wall an hour later, climbing up with the easy grace of someone who had spent her whole life navigating stone walls and steep roofs. Sophie was Elena's closest friend, sharp-tongued and loyal to a fault, the kind of person who noticed everything and forgave very little. "You are doing the thing again," Sophie said, settling beside her. "What thing?" "The staring at nothing thing, except it is never nothing. It is always the same window." Elena did not answer. Sophie sighed and bumped her shoulder gently against Elena's. "How is the wrist?" "Fine." He looked at it for 4 seconds and told me to wrap it. 4 seconds is a long time for him. Usually he does not look at anything for more than 2. Elena laughed despite herself, a short, tired sound. Sophie always knew how to pull her out of the spiral, even if only for a moment. "You know," Sophie continued, quieter now, "you could just tell him." "Tell him what?" "You know what. You know what." "Elena, 10 years. You have loved this man for 10 years and he does not even know your favorite color. It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple. You open your mouth and you say words. People do it every day." Elena shook her head slowly. Sophie did not understand, not really. Because Sophie had never loved someone who occupied a throne. Someone whose every choice was measured against the good of an entire kingdom. Someone who was expected to marry not for love but for alliance and strength and bloodline. Elena was the daughter of a blacksmith. She had no title, no land, no political weight to offer a king who needed all three. "There is talk," Sophie said carefully, watching Elena's face, "that the council is pushing for a match. With Lady Charlotte, from the Western Territories. Her pack controls the mountain passes. It would secure the trade routes." Elena had already heard the whispers, of course. Everyone had. The lower quarter buzzed with the news the way a hive buzzes before a storm. She had told herself it did not matter, that Damien had never been hers to lose, that you cannot lose something you never held. But hearing it said plainly, Sitting on this wall with her wrist throbbing and her heart doing something similar made it feel real in a way Whispers in the Market never had. When? She asked. Nothing is decided yet. The council wants it. Whether he wants it is another matter. Does it matter what he wants? He has never once done what he wanted, not since his father died. Sophie did not have an answer for that, because it was true. Damien had become king at 19, thrust into the role after his father collapsed from a fever that no healer could cure. He had spent every year since holding the kingdom together with sheer will, sacrificing every soft part of himself to keep the borders safe and the Pax unified. Elena had watched him do it, year after year, watched the boy who once shared honey bread with a hiding girl disappear beneath layers of duty, until only the king remained. She thought sometimes that if she could just remind him of that boy, just once, everything might be different. But that was a fantasy, the kind she allowed herself only in the dark, only on this wall, only when no one could see her face. The next morning, Elena reported for training despite her wrist, because that was what soldiers did, and because staying busy was the only remedy she had ever found for a heart that refused to be reasonable. She wrapped the cloth tighter, tucked her hair back, and walked to the yard where Damien stood reviewing a line of new recruits, his second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Owen, beside him with a scroll of names. Ward, Owen called out, using her family name the way the guard always did. You are on the Eastern Patrol rotation starting tomorrow, 3 days out, along the river. Understood, Elena said. Damien glanced at her then, just briefly, his gaze sliding over her wrapped wrist with something that might have been mild concern, or might have been nothing at all. It was impossible to tell with him. His face rarely gave anything away, a skill he had perfected out of necessity, ruling over packs that would exploit any visible weakness in an instant. Your wrist, he said. Can you handle the patrol? Yes, my king. He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, and for one wild heartbeat Elena wondered if he actually saw her, really saw her, the way she had always wanted to be seen. Then he nodded once and turned back to the recruits, already moving on to the next matter requiring his attention, and the moment collapsed like it always did, leaving her standing there with her wrapped wrist and her foolish, aching heart. That evening, walking back from the training yard, Elena passed the council hall and heard raised voices through the heavy wooden doors, left slightly ajar by whoever had last used them. She should have kept walking. She knew that even as she slowed her steps, even as she found herself standing just outside, listening. The Western Alliance is not optional, Your Grace, came the voice of Marcus, the eldest council member, sharp with the particular impatience of a man who had said the same thing many times before. Lady Charlotte brings the mountain passes and 3,000 warriors. Without her, the eastern border stands exposed the moment the wolves from the far ranges decide to test us. I am aware of the strategic value, Damien answered, his voice tired in a way Elena rarely heard it. I have read every report you have handed me for the past year. Then you understand there is no reasonable alternative. This is not about your preference, Your Grace. This is about the survival of everyone within these borders. There was a long pause. Elena held her breath without meaning to. I understand, Damien said finally, quietly. Draft the proposal. I will meet with Lady Charlotte's representatives next month. Elena did not remember walking away from the door. She only remembered finding herself back at the stone wall behind the barracks, the same spot as the night before, her chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with her injured wrist. She had always known this day would come. Knowing did not make it hurt less. She thought of the honey bread, of the fireflies, of 10 years spent loving a man in silence, because silence had felt safer than the alternative. She thought of Sophie's words, of how simple it was supposed to be, just opening your mouth and saying the truth. But what good would the truth do now, on the eve of an alliance that would secure the safety of thousands of people? What right did her small, private heartbreak have against the weight of an entire kingdom's protection? None, she decided. It had no right at all. For the first time in 10 years, Elena allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she was not standing on the outside of a lit window, watching a king who would never know her name the way she knew his. She did not yet know what that life would look like, or where she would find the courage to build it. But something inside her, something that had been quietly breaking for years, finally cracked all the way through, and in the space that crack left behind, a new and frightening thought began to take root. Maybe it was time to stop watching from the wall. Maybe it was time to leave. She did not act on the thought that night. Instead, she lay awake in her small room above her parents' forge, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the distant howl of a lone wolf somewhere in the northern hills, the creak of the old shutters her father kept meaning to fix. She thought about her mother, Grace, who had once told her that love without hope was still love, just a heavier kind to carry. She thought about her father, Henry, who had spent 30 years loving his work with the same quiet devotion, never asking for recognition, content simply to see his craft used well. Perhaps that was where she had learned to love this way, without expectation, without demand, simply because the loving itself felt like enough. But lying there in the dark, she was no longer certain it was enough. Not anymore. The following days passed in a blur of ordinary duty. She went on the Eastern Patrol despite her wrist, riding out with 3 other soldiers along the winding river that marked the edge of the kingdom's protected lands. The forest there was thick and old, full of shadows that shifted with the wind, and Elena found a strange comfort in the monotony of the ride, the rhythm of hooves against packed earth, the simple task of watching the tree line for danger, instead of watching a window for a light that never quite reached her. On the second night of the patrol, camped beside the river, one of her fellow soldiers, a quiet young man named Nathan, asked her why she had joined the guard in the first place. Most daughters of craftsmen married early or took up their parents' trade. Few chose the blade. I wanted to matter, Elena admitted, staring into the fire. I wanted to be someone the kingdom could not do without. And are you? Nathan asked. Someone the kingdom cannot do without. Elena did not answer for a long moment. The fire popped and hissed, sending small sparks up into the dark canopy above them. I do not think anyone is that, she said finally. I think we all just do our part and hope it adds up to something. Nathan nodded, seeming to accept this, and the conversation drifted to easier things, old stories from the barracks, jokes about the newer recruits who still flinched at the sound of their own training swords. But Elena's mind stayed on her own answer long after the conversation ended. She had wanted to matter. She had wanted to be irreplaceable, and yet she had spent 10 years loving a man who could replace her attention with a single glance toward someone else, who would soon be bound by duty to a woman from the western mountains, a woman Elena had never met, and already envied with a shame she could not quite shake. When the patrol returned 3 days later, the kingdom felt different somehow, though nothing visible had changed. Banners still hung from the main hall. Guards still stood at their posts. But word of the Western Alliance had spread further while she was away, and the lower quarter buzzed with speculation about what a match with Lady Charlotte would mean for trade, for taxes, for the balance of power between the packs. Elena walked through the market on her way home, half listening to the chatter around her, when she passed a group of children playing near the well, chanting an old rhyme about kings and queens that she remembered from her own childhood. She stopped, watching them for a moment, remembering a version of herself who used to believe that love was simple, that if you were good and patient and kind, the person you loved would eventually see you. She was not that girl anymore. 10 years had taught her otherwise. That evening she found Sophie waiting for her outside the forge, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the fading light. The betrothal talks begin next month, Sophie said without preamble. Marcus is already drafting terms. I know. I heard them arguing about it through the council doors. Sophie's eyes widened slightly. You were listening at the door. I was walking past. I could not help but hear. Elena, I know how it sounds. Sophie studied her for a long moment, and something in her friend's face softened from its usual sharpness into something closer to worry. What are you going to do? Elena looked past her, toward the main hall in the distance, its windows already glowing gold against the darkening sky. She thought of the boy who had shared honey bread with her once, of the man who had knelt to examine her wrist without truly seeing her, of the king who was about to be bound to another woman for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. I do not know yet, Elena admitted, but I know I cannot keep doing this, watching, waiting, hoping for something that is never going to happen. So you will tell him? No, Elena said quietly, and the word surprised her with how steady it sounded, how certain, as though some part of her had already decided this without consulting the rest of her. I do not think I will tell him anything at all. Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but something in Elena's expression stopped her. They stood there together in the gathering dark, two friends who had grown up together in the shadow of a kingdom neither of them would ever rule, and for the first time in 10 years, Elena felt something other than longing settle into her chest. It felt almost like resolve. It felt almost like the beginning of an ending she had not yet fully imagined, but one she suspected, deep down, she would soon be brave enough to choose. The knock on Damien's private study came just after midnight, sharp and urgent, the kind of knock that meant trouble had already started before anyone had the chance to prevent it. He was still awake, of course. He was always awake at this hour, poring over maps and grain reports by candlelight long after the rest of the castle had gone quiet. Enter, he said, not looking up. Owen stepped inside, his expression grim. Riders from the northern border. A hunting party from the far ranges crossed onto our land 3 nights ago. They killed 2 of our scouts before retreating. Damien's pen stopped moving. He set it down slowly and looked up at Owen with an expression that had gone completely still. The particular stillness that every soldier in the kingdom had learned to fear more than shouting. Names, Damien said. Corwin and young Peter. Peter had only been with us 2 seasons. Damien closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, allowing himself the smallest breath of grief. Before duty demanded he set it aside. This was the part of ruling that no one warned you about when you were a child playing at being king. It was not the crowns or the feasts or the respectful bowing of subjects. It was this, standing in a cold study at midnight, absorbing the deaths of men who had trusted him to keep them safe, and finding a way to keep functioning anyway. "Double the patrols along the northern line," he said. "Send word to the families. I will visit them myself before the week is out." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Owen, find out who authorized that hunting party to come so close to our border in the first place." This was not an accident. Owen nodded and left, and Damien sat alone in his study with the candle burning low, staring at the map spread across his desk, at the thin ink lines that represented borders men were willing to die defending. He thought, not for the first time, of how much simpler his father had made it look, ruling for 30 years without ever seeming burdened by the weight of it. It was only after his father's death that Damien had understood the truth. His father had not been unburdened. He had simply hidden it better, right up until the fever took him and the mask finally slipped away in his final days, revealing a man exhausted down to his bones. Damien had promised himself he would not become that. He had promised himself he would find some way to carry the weight without it hollowing him out entirely. 10 years into his reign, he was no longer certain the promise had been kept. He thought of Elena then, unexpectedly, the way he sometimes did in these quiet, exhausted hours when his guard slipped just slightly. He remembered her wrist earlier that week, the careful way she had held it, the flicker of something in her eyes when he had knelt beside her that he had not quite been able to name. He was not a man who noticed people easily. Years of ruling had taught him to see subjects as pieces on a board, useful in their roles, valuable for what they contributed to the whole. But there was something about Elena Ward that occasionally slipped past that careful cataloging, some quality he could not fully explain even to himself. He pushed the thought aside, the way he pushed aside most thoughts that did not directly serve the kingdom's needs, and returned to the map, tracing the northern border with one finger, already planning the reinforcement of patrols. The next morning brought the council meeting Marcus had been pushing for, and Damien arrived already tired, having slept perhaps 3 hours after finally leaving his study. The council chamber was a long room lined with tall windows, a heavy table down its center carved from a single ancient oak that had stood on these lands before the first king had ever claimed them. 6 council members sat waiting, along with Marcus at the head, his silver hair immaculate as always, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he was about to win an argument he had been having for months. "Your Grace," Marcus began, "the northern incursion only strengthens the case I have been making. Our defenses are stretched thin. We cannot continue holding every border alone." "We are not alone," Damien said. "We have allies among the southern packs and the coastal territories. Allies who offer sympathy but little else when trouble comes. Lady Charlotte's mountain forces are trained, disciplined, and numerous. A union with her territory would mean immediate reinforcement of our northern and western lines, precisely where we are weakest." Damien said nothing for a long moment, studying the grain of the old table rather than meeting Marcus's eyes. "And if I do not wish to marry for strategy alone," he said finally. The room went quiet. It was the first time in months that Damien had said anything that even hinted at personal reluctance, and the council members exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to a version of their king that admitted to wanting something beyond duty. "Your Grace," Marcus said, more gently now, "I understand. This is not the marriage a young man dreams of. But you are not merely a young man. You are the king, and 2 scouts died on our northern border 3 nights ago, because we do not yet have the strength to hold every line at once. Every season we delay this alliance is a season more lives are at risk." Damien closed his eyes briefly, the image of Peter's young, unlined face rising unbidden in his mind, a boy who had wanted nothing more than to serve his kingdom well, and had died for it before he had truly gotten the chance to live. "Draft the terms," Damien said quietly. "I will meet with Lady Charlotte's representatives as planned." The meeting ended shortly after, and Damien left the chamber feeling as though something inside him had been quietly, permanently sealed shut. He walked the long corridor back toward his private quarters, passing servants who bowed as he moved, guards who straightened at his approach, all of them treating him with the careful reverence due a king, none of them seeing the exhaustion that sat behind his eyes like a stone he could never quite set down. He found himself, without entirely meaning to, walking past the training yard instead of turning toward his study. Elena was there, sparring with another soldier, her wrapped wrist clearly still bothering her, though she moved through the drills with the same stubborn determination he had noticed in her since she was young. He remembered, distantly, a summer festival many years ago, a girl hiding behind a hay bale, though the memory was faded and uncertain, more feeling than image, and he was not entirely sure it was even real, or something his tired mind had constructed from fragments of a childhood he barely remembered clearly. He watched her for a moment longer than he intended to, long enough that Owen, standing nearby reviewing the recruits, noticed and raised an eyebrow slightly. "Something on your mind, Your Grace." "No," Damien said, perhaps too quickly. "Nothing at all." He turned and continued on toward his study, telling himself the small ache in his chest was simply exhaustion, the natural weight of grief for 2 dead scouts, and the looming reality of a marriage he had never wanted but could not refuse. He did not allow himself to consider that the ache might have another source entirely, something quieter and less easily explained, something that had been growing slowly for longer than he had ever admitted to himself. That evening, he visited the families of Corwin and Peter, as he had promised Owen he would. Peter's mother, a widow named Mirren who lived in a small cottage near the eastern gate, wept when she saw him at her door, and Damien stood there absorbing her grief the way he had learned to absorb all grief that came from his failures as king, taking it fully onto himself without flinching, because that was the only gift he had left to offer families who had lost everything else. "He believed in you," Mirren said through her tears. "He used to say the kingdom was lucky to have a king who cared so much about every soldier, not just the important ones." Damien did not know how to respond to that. He simply took her hand, promised that Peter's sacrifice would not be forgotten, and left feeling heavier than when he had arrived, the weight of a dead boy's faith in him settling alongside all the other weights he carried silently, day after day, year after year. Walking back toward the castle in the fading light, he passed the stone wall behind the training barracks, and noticed a figure sitting there alone, watching the windows of the main hall. He recognized her immediately, even from a distance, the particular way she held herself, straight-backed but somehow still soft at the edges. He almost called out to her. He almost changed his path to walk toward her instead of past her. Instead, he kept walking, telling himself it was not appropriate for a king on the eve of a political marriage to seek out conversation with a soldier from the lower quarter, no matter how curious he had become about the quiet, watchful way she seemed to exist at the edges of his world. He told himself this was simply exhaustion talking, grief looking for somewhere soft to land. He did not yet understand how wrong he was. He did not yet understand that the ache in his chest had a name, and that name was not exhaustion at all. It would take her leaving, and the terrible silence that followed, to finally teach him the difference. 3 days later, the representatives from Lady Charlotte's territory arrived, a small procession of riders in deep blue cloaks trimmed with silver, carrying banners that showed a mountain peak crowned with stars. Damien greeted them formally in the main hall, standing beside Marcus and 2 other council members, his face arranged into the practiced calm that had become his constant companion since the day his father died. Lady Charlotte's chief advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Isolde, wasted no time with pleasantries. Lady Charlotte sends her regards and her hope that these negotiations proceed swiftly. Winter approaches, and the mountain passes will soon be difficult to travel. "We share the hope for swiftness," Damien said, though the words tasted strange in his mouth, like a lie dressed up in diplomatic language. "Please, rest from your journey. We will begin formal discussions tomorrow." That night, alone in his chambers, Damien allowed himself something he rarely permitted, a moment of honest reflection without the armor of duty pressing down on every thought. He poured a small measure of dark wine, sat by the window overlooking the training yard, now empty and quiet under the moonlight, and thought about what it might mean to spend the rest of his life bound to a woman he had met exactly once, at a summer gathering years ago, whose laugh he could not remember and whose favorite season he did not know. He thought, too, unbidden, of small, unremarkable things that had somehow lodged themselves in his memory over the years without his notice. The way Elena Ward always arrived early to training, before the other soldiers, as though she needed the extra time to prove something to herself that no one else demanded of her. The careful, precise way she cared for the younger recruits who struggled, never mocking them the way some of the more seasoned soldiers did. The single time, 2 winters passed, when she had brought a wounded hawk to the castle healer rather than simply passing it by, cradling the injured bird against her chest through the cold, with a tenderness that had struck him as oddly out of place for a soldier trained to be hard. He did not know why these memories surfaced now, of all nights, on the eve of formal negotiations for a marriage that would secure his kingdom's borders for a generation. He told himself it meant nothing, that his mind was simply searching for distraction from a decision that weighed on him more heavily than he wanted to admit even to himself. The following morning, negotiations began in earnest, and Damien found himself sitting across a long table from Isolde and two other representatives, discussing dowries and troop allocations and trade agreements, as though arranging the terms of a business contract rather than a marriage. In some ways, he supposed, that was exactly what it was. Lady Charlotte herself was not present, occupied with matters in her own territory, and Damien found he could not entirely picture her face, only a vague impression from their single meeting years before. Dark hair and a confident bearing and very little else that had left a lasting mark. The negotiations stretched through the day and into the evening, technical and exhausting, full of careful phrasing designed to protect both territories from any future dispute. By the time Damien finally excused himself, the candles in the council chamber had burned low, and his mind felt stretched thin from hours of calculation and compromise. Walking back toward his quarters, he passed the training yard once more, and though it was well past the hour when soldiers typically trained, he found himself pausing at the low wall that bordered the yard, remembering the figure he had seen sitting there a few nights before. The wall was empty now, moonlight pooling across the worn stone, and Damien stood there longer than he meant to, feeling a strange, hollow disappointment that made no logical sense given everything else weighing on his mind. He told himself, walking away at last, that it was simply the exhaustion of the day catching up with him, nothing more significant than that. He did not yet have the language to name what he was feeling, and even if he had, he would not have allowed himself to dwell on it. Not with two soldiers freshly buried, and a marriage contract half negotiated, and a kingdom that needed him whole and steady, far more than it needed him honest with himself. But that night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Damien dreamed of a summer festival and a girl hiding behind a hay bale, and when he woke, the ache in his chest had not lessened at all. If anything, it had grown sharper, more insistent, a quiet voice beneath all his careful reasoning that whispered he was about to make a terrible mistake, though it would be many weeks yet before he understood exactly what that mistake would cost him. The letter arrived sealed with the mountain crest, and Elena knew before she even opened it that her life was about to change. She had been summoned, along with several other soldiers from the Eastern Patrol, to serve as part of the honor guard during the formal signing of the alliance between King Damien and Lady Charlotte. It was meant as an honor. It felt, to Elena, like a punishment designed by fate itself. She stood at the edge of the grand hall on the day of the ceremony, dressed in the polished uniform of the guard, her wrapped wrist finally healed enough to hold a ceremonial blade without pain. The hall had been transformed for the occasion, banners from both territories hanging side by side, long tables laden with food that the kitchens had spent 3 days preparing, musicians tuning their instruments in the corner. Elena had attended countless ceremonies in her years of service. None had ever made her stomach twist the way this one did. Lady Charlotte arrived at midday, and Elena watched her enter the hall with the rest of the gathered crowd, unable to look away despite every instinct urging her to turn her eyes elsewhere. Charlotte was tall, with dark hair braided elaborately with silver thread, and she moved through the hall with the easy confidence of someone born to command. She was, Elena had to admit even through the ache in her chest, striking in a way that made the comparison to herself feel almost cruel. Where Charlotte commanded a room simply by entering it, Elena had spent her whole life learning to be unnoticed, useful without being conspicuous, present without demanding attention. Damien stood at the front of the hall beside Marcus and the other council members, dressed in formal dark blue, a crown of simple silver resting on his head, the one he wore only for occasions requiring the full weight of his authority displayed. Elena had seen him wear it perhaps 3 times in her life. Each time, she had thought he looked less like the boy who once shared honey bread with her, and more like a statue carved to represent duty itself. The formal proceedings began with speeches from both sides, careful diplomatic language about unity and strength, and the prosperity that would follow this union of territories. Elena listened with half her attention, the other half consumed by watching Damien's face for any sign of what he truly felt, any crack in the careful composure he wore like armor. She found nothing. His expression remained perfectly, terribly neutral throughout, as though he were witnessing a treaty between distant nations, rather than the arrangement of his own future. When the moment came for Damien and Charlotte to exchange the ceremonial vow of intent, a formal promise that preceded the actual mating bond by several months, allowing both parties time to prepare their territories for the transition. Elena found she could not watch. She stared instead at the polished stone floor, at the reflection of candlelight flickering across its surface, and tried to remember why she had ever allowed herself to hope for something that had always been impossible. "I offer my hand and my territory, in service of a stronger, safer kingdom," Charlotte said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, confident and unwavering. "I accept this offering, in service of the same," Damien replied, his voice steady, giving nothing away. The hall erupted in applause, and Elena forced her hands together in the expected gesture, feeling as though she were watching the scene from somewhere outside her own body, some distant vantage point where the pain of it could not quite reach her. It did reach her, of course. It reached her fully, completely, settling into her chest like a stone she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life. After the formal proceedings ended, the hall shifted into celebration, tables of food opening to the gathered crowd, musicians beginning a lively melody that filled the space with sound. Elena remained at her post along the wall, watching the celebration unfold around her, feeling more alone in that crowded hall than she had ever felt in her entire life. It was during this celebration that she overheard the conversation that would finally break whatever fragile hope had remained inside her, hope she had told herself she no longer carried, but which had apparently survived, hidden and stubborn, until this exact moment. She had stepped away from her post briefly to refill a water pitcher for the guard rotation, passing close to an alcove where Damien stood speaking quietly with Owen, both men clearly believing themselves unheard by the celebration around them. "You do not seem pleased, Your Grace," Owen said, his voice low. "Pleased is not a requirement of my position," Damien replied. "The alliance is necessary. My feelings on the matter are irrelevant. For what it is worth, I do not think anyone expects you to love her. Marriages like this rarely involve love at all." Damien was quiet for a long moment. "No, I do not suppose they do." "Is there someone else?" Owen asked, his tone careful, curious in a way that suggested this was not an idle question. "I have noticed you watching the training yard more than usual these past weeks." Elena froze where she stood, the water pitcher suddenly heavy in her hands. Damien's response, when it came, was flat and dismissive in a way that cut deeper than she had thought possible. "There is no one else, Owen. There cannot be. I am a king, not a boy free to indulge in fantasies about soldiers from the lower quarter. Whatever passing curiosity I may have felt means nothing beside what this kingdom requires of me. It was foolishness, and I have already set it aside." Elena did not wait to hear anything more. She turned and walked away, the water sloshing over the edge of the pitcher and soaking into her uniform sleeve, though she barely noticed. Foolishness, he had called it, a passing curiosity, already set aside. Whatever small, fragile hope she had allowed herself to nurture over 10 long years, whatever moments she had turned over and over in her mind like precious stones, he had reduced to nothing more than an inconvenient distraction from his real responsibilities. She should not have been surprised. She had known, logically, that this was likely how he saw things, if he thought of her at all, but hearing it confirmed so plainly, in his own voice, stripped away the last thin layer of hope she had not even realized she was still carrying. She spent the rest of the celebration performing her duties with mechanical precision, smiling when smiling was expected, standing straight when standing straight was required, all while something inside her quietly, permanently rearranged itself. By the time the celebration ended and the guests began retiring to their chambers, Elena had made a decision, though she would not have called it a decision so much as a recognition of something that had been building inside her for weeks, perhaps years, finally reaching its breaking point. She found Sophie later that night, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the barracks, staring at nothing in particular. "How was the ceremony?" Sophie asked gently, already reading something in Elena's expression that told her the answer before Elena spoke. "He called it foolishness," Elena said quietly. "Whatever he might have felt, watching me. A passing curiosity, already set aside." Sophie's face fell. She crossed the room and sat beside Elena, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "He does not know what he is saying. Men like him, men who have spent their whole lives being told feelings are a weakness, they say foolish things to protect themselves from foolish things they actually feel. It does not matter what he actually feels, Sophie." He said it out loud, to Owen, without knowing I could hear. "That is what he believes when he thinks no one is listening. That is the truth of it." Sophie did not have an answer for that, because there was no argument against words spoken in a private moment, words meant for no one's ears but a trusted friend's. Elena had spent 10 years building a fragile structure of hope on stolen glances and half-remembered childhood moments, and Damien had just demonstrated, without even knowing it, exactly how little that structure had ever meant to him. "What will you do?" Sophie asked finally. Elena looked toward the small window of the barracks, where the moon hung low and pale over the training yard, over the stone wall where she had spent so many nights watching a light she could never step into. "I am going to leave," she said, and this time, saying it aloud, the words felt less like a wild, desperate thought, and more like the only sensible path forward. "Not tomorrow, not next week, but soon. I cannot keep living like this, loving someone who has already decided I am foolishness to be set aside. I need to build a life that does not depend on him ever seeing me." Sophie held her tighter, and neither of them said anything more that night. But something had shifted between them, an understanding that whatever came next, whatever Elena chose to do, their friendship would carry the weight of it together. The days following the ceremony passed strangely for Elena, colored by a new clarity that felt almost like relief beneath the grief. She no longer found herself glancing toward the main hall windows in the evenings, no longer lingered near the council chamber hoping to catch some glimpse of Damien passing through the corridors. It was as though hearing his words had cauterized something inside her, painful in the moment but somehow cleaner than the slow, quiet ache she had carried for so many years. She began, without fully admitting to herself what she was doing, to take stock of her life. She visited her parents more often than usual, sitting in the familiar kitchen above the forge, watching her mother Grace grind herbs for a healing salve, while her father Henry hammered away at a length of iron in the workshop below, the rhythmic clang carrying up through the floorboards like a heartbeat. "You have been quiet lately," Grace observed one evening, not looking up from her work. "Quieter than usual, and you have always been the quiet one." "Just tired from training," Elena said, though her mother's knowing glance suggested she was not entirely convinced. "Your father and I did not build this family by staying where we were unhappy," Grace said carefully. "I grew up 2 territories east of here. Did you know that? I came to these lands because your father found work in a forge that needed a partner, and because staying where I was no longer felt like living." Elena looked up, surprised. Her mother rarely spoke of her life before settling in the Packlands, and Elena had never thought to ask, the way children rarely think to ask about their parents' lives before they existed. "Did you ever regret it?" Elena asked, "leaving everything you knew?" "Every day, for the first year," Grace admitted, finally setting down her mortar and pestle to look at her daughter directly. "And then one day, I did not regret it anymore, because the life I had built here had become more real to me than the one I left behind. Leaving is never easy, Elena. But sometimes it is the only way to discover what you are actually capable of building, once you are no longer waiting for someone else to build it for you." Elena said nothing, but she carried her mother's words with her for days afterward, turning them over the way she once turned over memories of honey bread and fireflies. She began, quietly and carefully, to consider what a different life might actually look like. She thought of the southern territories, where she had heard smaller packs often needed experienced soldiers willing to help train their guard. Packs too small to maintain large standing forces of their own, but desperate for the security that trained warriors could provide. She thought of starting somewhere new, somewhere no one knew her as the quiet soldier who had loved her king for 10 years without ever speaking a word of it. She did not share these thoughts with anyone but Sophie, and even then, only in fragments, testing the idea aloud the way one tests ice before stepping fully onto it. Sophie, for her part, listened without judgment, offering neither encouragement nor discouragement, simply holding space for her friend to think through a decision that would reshape both their lives. Meanwhile, the kingdom moved forward with the business of the alliance. Formal announcements were made throughout the territories, criers reading proclamations in every village square, describing the strengthened bond between the eastern and western lands, the increased security this union would bring to all who lived beneath the king's protection. Elena heard the proclamations same as everyone else, standing in the market square on an errand for her mother, listening to words that once would have devastated her freshly all over again, but now simply confirmed a truth she had already accepted. She caught sight of Damien only twice more in the weeks that followed, both times from a distance, both times feeling a strange sensation that was not quite the familiar ache of longing but something closer to looking at a stranger, someone whose face she recognized but whose inner life had become suddenly, completely unknowable to her. The first time he was reviewing troops in the training yard, his expression as neutral and composed as always. The second time, he was walking with Lady Charlotte through the castle gardens, the two of them speaking quietly, though Elena was too far away to hear any words, only close enough to see the careful, formal distance both of them maintained, neither one reaching for the other's hand, neither one laughing at anything the other said. It should have brought her some small comfort, seeing that whatever bound them together was clearly built on strategy rather than genuine warmth. Instead, it only reinforced the quiet certainty settling deeper into her bones each day. She could not stay here, watching a marriage of convenience unfold between a man she loved and a woman who commanded mountain passes, waiting for some miracle that would never arrive. She needed to build something of her own, somewhere far from these lands, somewhere she could finally stop measuring her worth against a king's passing glance. By the time autumn's first cold winds began sweeping down from the northern hills, Elena had made her decision fully, no longer a fragile thought turned over in private moments, but a plan taking careful, deliberate shape. She began, quietly and without drawing attention, to prepare for a departure she intended to make as clean and untraceable as possible, understanding instinctively that the fewer questions asked, the easier this transition would be for everyone involved, herself most of all. Elena counted the coins hidden beneath the loose floorboard of her room for the third time that week, though the number never changed, and she already knew exactly how far it would carry her. Not far enough for comfort, but far enough for a beginning, which was all she needed. She had been saving quietly for nearly a month now, setting aside small portions of her guard wages, selling a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, jewelry she had never worn but could not bring herself to part with until now, when a new life mattered more than sentiment. She had settled on the Southern Territories, a place called Fen Hollow, a smaller pack that bordered a wide river delta, far from the political currents of the Eastern Kingdom. She had heard of it through Nathan, her fellow soldier from the Eastern Patrol, who had a cousin living there and spoke of it as a quiet, unremarkable place where a skilled soldier could find steady work training the local guard. Unremarkable was exactly what Elena wanted now. She had spent 10 years being quietly extraordinary in her devotion to a man who barely noticed her. She wanted, more than anything, to simply disappear into ordinary life for a while. The hardest part of her planning was not the practical matters of coin and destination, but the question of what to tell the people who loved her. She could not simply vanish without a word, not to her parents, who had raised her with such care, and certainly not to Sophie, who had stood beside her through every difficult year of loving Damien in silence. But she also could not tell the full truth, could not say plainly that she was leaving, because she could no longer bear to watch a king she loved build a life with someone else, because saying it aloud made the pain feel fresh and unbearable all over again, and because some part of her feared that speaking the truth too clearly might somehow reach him, might somehow turn her quiet departure into a spectacle she desperately wanted to avoid. She settled, finally, on a version of the truth that felt honest without being complete. She would tell her parents she had been offered a position training soldiers in a smaller territory, an opportunity for advancement that the Eastern Kingdom, with its abundance of skilled guards, could never offer someone of her rank. It was not entirely a lie. Nathan's cousin had mentioned, in passing, that Fen Hollow's pack leader was always looking for experienced trainers. Elena simply intended to make the opportunity real by seeking it out herself, rather than waiting for it to be offered. She told her mother first, on a quiet evening when her father was occupied at the forge and the kitchen held only the two of them and the low light of a single candle. Fen Hollow, Grace repeated, turning the name over as though testing its weight. That is a long journey from here. It is a good opportunity, Mother. A chance to train soldiers, to build something of my own rather than always being one voice among many in a guard this large. Grace studied her daughter for a long moment, and Elena wondered, with a flicker of anxiety, how much her mother truly understood, whether the woman who had raised her could see straight through the careful explanation to the grief underneath. But if Grace suspected anything more, she did not press. You have always been someone who needed room to grow into her own shape, Grace said finally, reaching across the table to take Elena's hand. I will not pretend I am not sad to see you go. But I remember what it felt like to leave everything I knew behind, and I remember that it was, in the end, the right choice for the life I wanted to build. If this is what you need, then you have my blessing, and your father's too, once you tell him. Telling her father proved harder in a different way, not because Henry questioned her decision, but because his quiet pride in her choice, his gruff insistence that she take extra coin from his own savings to help her settle into her new home, nearly broke the careful composure she had built around this entire plan. She left the forge that evening with tears she had not expected, grateful beyond words for parents who trusted her enough to let her go without demanding explanations she was not ready to give. Sophie was the hardest conversation of all. Elena found her friend in the barracks, mending a torn strap on her training gear, and sat down beside her without quite knowing how to begin. You have that face again, Sophie said, not looking up from her work. The one that means you are about to tell me something I will not want to hear. I am leaving, Elena said quietly. Fen Hollow, in the Southern Territories. There is a position training soldiers there. Sophie's hands went still. She set down the strap and looked up, her expression carrying none of the surprise Elena had expected, only a deep, resigned sadness, as though she had known this moment was coming long before Elena had found the courage to speak it aloud. "When?" Sophie asked. "2 weeks. I want to leave before the winter roads become too difficult to travel. And what am I supposed to tell people when they ask why you left so suddenly, why you did not simply request a transfer through proper channels, why you slipped away without so much as a farewell gathering? Tell them what I told my parents. A good opportunity, one I did not want to lose to delay." Sophie shook her head slowly. "You know that is not the whole truth." "It does not need to be the whole truth, Sophie. It just needs to be enough truth to let me go without 100 questions I do not have the strength to answer." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched her friend's jaw tighten, watched her visibly wrestle with something before finally speaking again. "I understand why you are doing this. I have watched you carry this for 10 years, and I have watched what it has cost you, piece by piece, year after year. But I am going to miss you more than I know how to say, and some small, selfish part of me wants to beg you to stay, even though I know staying would only keep hurting you." Elena pulled her friend into an embrace, feeling the weight of 10 years of shared history in the tightness of Sophie's arms around her. "You will visit me. Fen Hollow is not so far that a determined friend could not make the journey once a year at least." "I will hold you to that," Sophie said, pulling back with a watery laugh. "And you will write. Often. Do not become one of those people who disappears into a new life and forgets everyone who loved her in the old one. I could never forget you, Sophie. Not in 100 lifetimes." Over the following 2 weeks, Elena moved through her final days in the Eastern Kingdom with a strange, quiet efficiency, tying up loose ends, submitting a formal request for transfer that Owen approved without much comment, packing the few possessions she wished to carry with her into a single worn traveling bag. She said careful, measured farewells to the soldiers she had trained alongside for years, accepted their well wishes with genuine gratitude, and made certain, above all else, that her departure appeared exactly as ordinary as she had described it to her parents. A soldier seeking advancement elsewhere, nothing more remarkable than that. She did not see Damien again before she left. She told herself this was simply practical, that their paths rarely crossed in the ordinary course of guard duty, that there was no reason to seek out a farewell with a king who had already made his feelings about her clear, however unintentionally, in that overheard conversation with Owen. But some small, stubborn part of her had hoped, right up until the morning of her departure, that fate might arrange one final glimpse of him, one last moment to carry with her, into whatever life waited in Fen Hollow. It did not happen. On the morning she left, riding out through the eastern gate with Sophie standing at the barracks entrance, tears streaming freely down her face despite her best efforts to remain composed, Damien was in council meetings that would run long into the afternoon, discussing supply logistics for the coming winter. Entirely unaware that the woman who had loved him quietly for a decade was riding away from the only home she had ever known, carrying nothing but a single traveling bag, and a heart she hoped might finally begin to heal in the distance between them. She did not look back at the castle walls as she rode. She had spent 10 years looking back, watching, waiting, hoping. This time, she kept her eyes fixed firmly on the southern road ahead, and told herself, with every mile that passed beneath her horse's steady hooves, that she was finally, truly free. The road south wound through territory Elena had never traveled, past small farming villages tucked into valleys, through stretches of dense forest where sunlight filtered down in scattered patches across the packed earth path. She traveled with a small group of merchants heading toward the coastal markets, having arranged the company for safety rather than seeking solitude, though she spoke little during the journey, content to listen to the merchants discuss prices and trade routes while her own thoughts turned inward, sorting through everything she was leaving behind. On the third night of travel, camped beside a shallow stream with the merchant's fire crackling nearby, Elena found herself unable to sleep, staring up at unfamiliar stars through a gap in the tree canopy. She thought of her mother's words about building a life more real than the one left behind. She thought of Sophie's tearful farewell, of her father's quiet pride, of the strange, hollow ache in her chest that felt less like heartbreak now, and more like the tender soreness of a wound finally beginning to close. She thought, too, despite her best efforts not to, of Damien, of the boy who had shared honey bread with a hiding girl so many years ago, of the king who had knelt to examine her wrist without ever truly seeing her. She wondered if he would notice her absence at all, or if her name would simply fade from the guard rosters like so many soldiers before her who had moved on to other postings, other lives, forgotten within a season by everyone except the friends who had loved them. She did not yet know that her absence would not fade quietly at all, that the careful, ordinary explanation she had crafted would soon prove far too thin to survive the questions that were coming. She did not yet know that somewhere back in the Eastern Kingdom, a king who believed he had already set aside his passing curiosity about a quiet soldier was about to discover exactly how wrong that belief had been. The merchant's journey brought her within 2 days' ride of Fen Hollow by the following week, and she parted ways with them at a crossroads market town, thanking them for their company and their protection along the dangerous stretches of Forest Road. From there she traveled alone, following directions Nathan's cousin had given her, through increasingly unfamiliar country until the wide, glittering expanse of the river delta finally came into view, marshlands stretching toward a distant horizon where the land met a pale, wide sky. Fen Hollow itself proved smaller than she had expected, a cluster of wooden buildings arranged around a central square, the pack's guard consisting of perhaps 30 soldiers, far fewer and far less disciplined than the forces she had trained alongside in the Eastern Kingdom. The pack leader, a weathered man named Caleb who had held his position for over 20 years, welcomed her with the cautious optimism of someone who recognized skilled help but had learned through hard experience not to trust good fortune too quickly. Nathan's cousin spoke well of you, Caleb said, studying her with sharp, assessing eyes. Said you trained under the Eastern Kingdom's guard for a decade. That is considerable experience for a territory like ours. I am looking for a fresh start, Elena said, which was, she reflected, the truest thing she had said to anyone since making her decision to leave, and I have heard your guard could use additional training. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We can use all the help we can get. The position is yours if you want it, though I will warn you, the pay is modest and the accommodations simple. We are not the Eastern Kingdom here. Modest and simple sounds like exactly what I am looking for, Elena said, and meant it. She began her new position within days, settling into a small cottage near the edge of the settlement, close enough to the marshlands that she could hear the calls of waterbirds each morning as she rose before dawn to begin training the local guard. The work was different from what she had known, less polished, more urgent in its practicality, teaching soldiers who had never faced formal combat training the basic skills they needed to protect a territory that had, until now, relied more on isolation than strength for its safety. It was difficult, exhausting work, and Elena found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she loved it. There was something clarifying about building something entirely her own, unburdened by 10 years of quiet longing, unburdened by the weight of watching a king who would never see her the way she had once hoped. She wrote to Sophie regularly, as promised, careful letters describing her new life, without dwelling too long on the ache that still lingered beneath the surface, an ache she suspected might never fully disappear, but which grew quieter, more manageable, with each passing week of honest, useful work. She did not know, as autumn deepened into winter and her new life in Fen Hollow slowly took root, that back in the Eastern Kingdom, her absence had begun to unravel something no one, least of all Elena herself, had ever expected it to touch. The report crossed Damien's desk on an ordinary Tuesday morning, buried among a dozen other administrative matters requiring his signature, and he nearly signed it without a second glance the way he signed most routine transfer requests. It was Owen who stopped him, standing at the edge of the study with a strange expression Damien could not quite place. You approved Ward's transfer request 3 weeks ago, Owen said. Did you know she left already? Damien looked down at the document in front of him, a routine confirmation of departure, the kind filed whenever a soldier officially completed a transfer to another territory. He scanned the details without much interest at first, then stopped when he reached the destination listed at the bottom of the page. Fen Hollow. A small southern pack he barely knew existed, so far from any strategic significance that he could not recall a single report mentioning it in years. She requested a transfer to Fen Hollow, Damien said slowly. That seems an unusual choice for a soldier of her training. That is what I thought as well, Owen said, though I approved it without much thought at the time. It seemed routine enough. A soldier seeking advancement in a smaller territory where her experience would be more valued. Damien set the document down and stared at it for a long moment, an uncomfortable feeling settling in his chest that he could not immediately explain. He told himself it was simply surprise, the natural reaction to learning that a capable soldier had chosen to leave the Eastern Kingdom's guard for a territory with far less prestige and far fewer resources. It was, after all, an unusual choice, the kind that invited questions. But as the day wore on, moving through his usual duties, reviewing reports and meeting with council members about the upcoming winter provisions, Damien found his mind returning again and again to that single line of information. Fen Hollow. He had not seen Elena Ward in the training yard in weeks, though he had not consciously registered her absence until this moment. And now that he had, small details began surfacing in his memory that he had not thought to examine before. He remembered passing the training yard perhaps 2 weeks earlier, and noticing, distantly, that the drills seemed slightly different, less structured, though he had been too consumed with council business to consider why. He remembered Owen mentioning, in passing, that they were down a soldier for the winter border rotations and would need to adjust the schedule accordingly. He had not asked which soldier, had not thought to ask, because such adjustments were routine matters that rarely required his direct attention. He had not thought to ask because he had not imagined, even for a moment, that the soldier in question might be her. That evening, alone in his study, Damien found himself pulling out old guard rosters, tracing back through months of records with a methodical thoroughness that felt, even to him, slightly excessive for what should have been an unremarkable administrative curiosity. He found her name listed consistently across years of Eastern Patrol assignments, training yard attendance, guard duty rotations, a steady, reliable presence that he had apparently absorbed into the background of his awareness without ever truly registering its significance. He thought of the wounded hawk she had carried to the healer 2 winters past. He thought of her wrapped wrist, the careful way she had held it, the flicker of something in her eyes when he had knelt beside her weeks before the alliance ceremony. He thought, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, of a conversation with Owen in an alcove during Lady Charlotte's arrival celebration, a conversation he had believed private, words he had spoken carelessly, because he had not imagined anyone could overhear them. There is no one else. Whatever passing curiosity I may have felt means nothing beside what this kingdom requires of me. It was foolishness, and I have already set it aside. Damien set down the guard roster and sat very still in the quiet of his study, a terrible suspicion beginning to form at the edges of his mind, one he immediately tried to dismiss as impossible, as far too convenient a story constructed from fragments that likely meant nothing at all. Soldiers transferred to other territories regularly. There was no reason to believe Elena Ward's departure had anything to do with words he had spoken in a private moment, words that had, admittedly, referenced her presence in the training yard, though not by name, not in any way that should have reached her ears at all. He told himself this reasoning was sound. He told himself, repeatedly, over the following days, that his growing unease about her departure was simply misplaced guilt, the natural discomfort of a man who had spoken carelessly about someone without considering that his words might somehow find their way to unintended listeners. He did not allow himself to consider the alternative explanation taking shape at the edges of his awareness, because that explanation would require him to confront feelings he had spent years carefully burying beneath the weight of duty and responsibility. But small things continued to unravel his careful denial, piece by piece, in the weeks that followed. He noticed, reviewing reports with Owen, that the Eastern Patrol had struggled with an incident along the river border that Elena's experience might have prevented, a minor skirmish with wandering scouts that resulted in an injury among the newer recruits. He noticed, passing through the market on an inspection of winter provisions, a blacksmith's forge he had never paid particular attention to before, and found himself wondering, with an intensity that surprised him, whether the blacksmith working the forge was her father. He noticed, most troublingly of all, a persistent restlessness that had settled into his days since learning of her departure, a restlessness that no amount of council business or border patrols seemed able to quiet. He found himself distracted during meetings, his mind drifting toward questions he could not fully articulate even to himself. Why Fen Hollow, a territory of no strategic significance? Why so suddenly, so quietly, without the formal farewell gathering that soldiers of her tenure typically received? Why had she never once, in 10 years of service, sought advancement or recognition, content instead to remain a steady, reliable presence at the edges of the guard, until suddenly she was not content with that at all? Owen noticed his king's distraction as well, though he said nothing directly for several weeks, watching Damien's growing preoccupation with a careful, patient concern that finally broke into open conversation one evening in late autumn, as the 2 men reviewed border patrol assignments by candlelight in Damien's study. "You have asked about Ward's transfer 3 times this month," Owen said finally, setting down his own papers to study his king directly. "That is 3 more times than you have asked about any other routine transfer in the 10 years I have served beside you." Damien did not answer immediately, his jaw tightening slightly at being so plainly observed. "Is there something you would like to tell me, Your Grace?" Owen continued, his tone carrying none of the formal distance their positions typically required, speaking instead as the old friend he had been since childhood. "Because I have known you a long time, and I have never seen you fixate on a transfer request the way you have fixated on this one." Damien set down his own papers and stared at the candle flame for a long moment, feeling something inside him finally beginning to crack open, some careful wall he had built years ago beginning, at last, to show its first fractures. "I do not know what I am feeling, Owen," Damien admitted quietly, the words coming slowly, reluctantly, as though each one cost him something significant to speak aloud. "I only know that since learning she left, I have not been able to stop thinking about her, and I do not understand why a soldier's routine transfer should occupy so much of my attention when I have an alliance to finalize and a kingdom to protect." Owen studied him for a long moment, something like sympathy crossing his weathered face. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "it is not so routine as you are telling yourself it is." Damien did not answer that, because he did not yet have an answer to give. But that night, long after Owen had left and the candle had burned down to a stub, Damien sat alone in his study, staring at the guard roster still spread across his desk, Elena's name listed there among years of faithful service, and allowed himself, for the first time, to truly wonder whether he had made a catastrophic mistake in believing his feelings for her were nothing more than foolishness to be set aside. The following week brought Lady Charlotte to the castle for a brief visit, part of the ongoing preparations for the formal mating bond scheduled for the coming spring. Damien met with her in the castle gardens, walking the gravel paths between rows of frost-hardy flowers as autumn settled fully over the grounds, and found himself, for the first time since their alliance began, studying her with genuine curiosity rather than the polite, distant courtesy he had maintained throughout their negotiations. "You seem distracted, Your Grace," Charlotte observed, her tone carrying more perceptiveness than he had credited her with during their earlier, more formal exchanges. "Is something troubling you?" "Forgive me," Damien said. "Matters of the border have occupied my thoughts more than usual." Charlotte studied him with the sharp, assessing gaze he had noticed in her advisor Isolde as well. A family trait, apparently, of reading people carefully before committing to trust. "You do not need to pretend with me, Damien. Whatever this arrangement between us is meant to become, I would rather build it on honesty than performance. We are not marrying for love, we both know that, but I would like to think we might still become allies who speak truthfully with one another, if nothing else." Her directness surprised him, and something in her words loosened a tightness he had been carrying for weeks without fully realizing it. "There was a soldier," Damien said slowly, testing the words aloud for the first time to anyone beyond Owen, "in my guard. She transferred to a southern territory recently, rather suddenly, and I find I cannot stop thinking about why." Charlotte's expression did not shift into judgment or offense, as he had half feared it might, but rather into something almost like understanding. "And you believe her departure may have something to do with you?" "I do not know. I said something, carelessly, before your arrival ceremony, words I believed were private. If she overheard them, I can only imagine how they must have sounded to her." "What did you say?" Damien hesitated, then repeated the conversation as best he could remember it. Owen's question about someone else, his own dismissive answer about foolishness and passing curiosity, words spoken to protect himself from a truth he had not been ready to face. Charlotte listened without interruption, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying the frost-hardy flowers lining the path rather than his face. "I think," she said finally, "that you already know the answer to your own question, Damien, and you are simply afraid to say it aloud. For what it is worth, I do not need you to love me. I need a strong alliance and a stable border, and I believe we can build that together regardless of what you feel for someone else. But I would advise you, as someone who values honesty above comfortable arrangements, to determine exactly what you are feeling before that feeling costs you something you cannot get back." Her words stayed with him long after their walk ended, echoing through the quiet hours of the following days as he tried, and largely failed, to focus on the mounting responsibilities of winter preparation and border security. He found himself, more and more often, returning to memories he had spent years pushing to the periphery of his awareness, memories of a quiet soldier who had never once asked anything of him beyond what her position required, who had cared for wounded creatures with unexpected tenderness, who had watched him, he now suspected, with far more attention than he had ever returned. By the time the first true snow fell over the Eastern Kingdom, blanketing the training yard where he had once knelt to examine an injured wrist without truly seeing the person attached to it, Damien had stopped pretending, even to himself, that his growing preoccupation with Elena Ward's absence was simply idle curiosity. Something had shifted in him, slow and undeniable, and he no longer knew how to set it aside, no matter how firmly duty demanded that he try. He found himself standing at the edge of the training yard, one bitter cold evening, watching snow settle over the stone wall behind the barracks, The same wall where he had once seen a solitary figure sitting in the moonlight without understanding what he was truly looking at. He thought of Mirren, Peter's grieving mother, telling him that her son had believed the kingdom lucky to have a king who cared about every soldier, not just the important ones. He wondered, standing there in the cold, whether he had truly cared for every soldier the way Peter believed, or whether he had simply been too consumed with the weight of ruling to notice the ones who mattered most. He thought of Elena's careful, steady presence across 10 years of service, a presence he had taken entirely for granted, assuming it would simply always be there, unchanging, undemanding, until the day it was not there at all. He thought of his own words, spoken carelessly in a moment he had believed private, words that had perhaps driven away someone whose quiet devotion he had never properly recognized until it was already gone. Owen found him there, still standing at the edge of the empty yard, as full darkness settled over the kingdom. "You cannot stand out here all night, Your Grace. The cold will do you no favors." "I keep asking myself the same question, Owen," Damien said quietly, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "If I had simply looked at her, truly looked at her, even once in all these years, would things have been different? Would she still be here?" Owen did not answer right away, watching his king with an expression that carried both sympathy and a quiet, patient wisdom earned from years of loyal service. "I do not know, Your Grace. But I do know that wondering will not bring her back, and standing in the cold will not answer the question either. If this matters to you as much as it seems to, perhaps it is time to stop wondering and start finding out." Damien turned to look at him then, something resolute finally settling into his expression, replacing the uncertainty that had plagued him for weeks. "Perhaps you are right." He did not yet know exactly what finding out would require of him, how far he would need to travel, how much of his careful, controlled world he would need to upend, in order to seek answers to questions he had avoided for far too long. But standing there in the falling snow, watching his breath cloud the frigid air, Damien Ashford made a decision that would soon turn his entire kingdom upside down, though he could not yet have imagined just how far the consequences would reach. Sophie stood rigid in the doorway of the small barracks room she had shared with Elena for years, watching King Damien Ashford stand awkwardly in the narrow space, clearly uncertain how to explain his presence there. She had never once seen him in the enlisted quarters in all her years of service, and his appearance now, alone, without Owen or any formal escort, struck her as so far outside the ordinary pattern of his behavior that she found herself too startled to speak for several long moments. "Forgive the intrusion," Damien said finally, his voice carrying an uncertainty she had never heard from him before. "I understand this room once belonged to Elena Ward, before her transfer." "It did," Sophie said carefully, watching him with the wary caution of someone protecting something precious. "Why does that concern you, Your Grace?" Damien was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving across the small, sparse room, the narrow bed still pushed against the same wall, a few personal items Sophie had not yet had the heart to pack away entirely. "I am trying to understand something," he said finally, "about her departure, about why she left so suddenly, without the farewell her years of service deserved." Sophie crossed her arms, studying him with an intensity that made him shift slightly under her gaze. "With respect, Your Grace, if you wanted to understand Elena, you had 10 years to do so while she stood right in front of you. Why does her absence suddenly demand your attention now?" The bluntness of the question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment, Sophie watched something genuine flicker across his usually composed expression, something that looked almost like shame. "You are right to question me," Damien admitted. "I have no good answer for why I did not see her clearly while she was still here. I only know that since learning of her departure, I have not been able to stop thinking about her, and I am trying to understand whether my own actions contributed to her decision to leave." Sophie studied him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind, some decision about how much loyalty she owed to a friend who had asked for privacy against how much truth this man standing before her seemed to genuinely need to hear. Finally, she crossed to the small chest at the foot of the bed, the one piece of furniture Elena had left behind rather than carry the added weight on her journey south, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal that Sophie had found tucked beneath a loose floorboard weeks after Elena's departure, when she had finally gathered the courage to pack away her friend's remaining belongings. "I should not be showing you this," Sophie said, holding the journal but not yet extending it toward him. "It is not mine to share, and Elena would likely never forgive me if she knew. But I think you need to understand exactly what you missed, Your Grace, because I do not believe you have any real idea." She handed him the journal, and Damien took it with careful, almost reverent hands, as though sensing the weight of what he was about to receive. He opened it slowly, and Sophie watched his face as his eyes moved across the first page. watched something in his expression begin to shift and crack as he read words Elena had written years ago, describing a summer festival, a hiding spot behind a hay bale, a boy who had shared honey bread without asking anything in return. She remembered that, Damien said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I had imagined it. I thought it was simply a fragment my tired mind had constructed from nothing. She remembered every small kindness you ever showed her. Your grace, whether you meant them as kindness or not, Sophie said. She kept this journal for years, writing down moments that meant something to her, moments you likely do not even remember, because to you they were nothing more than passing interactions in an ordinary day. To her, they were everything she had. Damien continued reading, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages, moving through years of careful, private devotion recorded in Elena's own handwriting. He read about the wounded hawk, about her decision to become a soldier, partly because she had wanted, more than anything, to matter to a kingdom that included him. He read entries from more recent months, describing the growing weight of watching the alliance negotiations unfold, the pain of standing at the ceremony while he exchanged vows with Lady Charlotte, and finally, the entry that made his breath catch entirely. He called it foolishness. Whatever he might have felt, watching me, a passing curiosity, already set aside, I have spent 10 years loving a man who has just told his most trusted friend that I mean nothing to him beyond an inconvenient distraction. I do not know how to keep carrying this. I think, finally, it is time to stop. Damien closed the journal slowly, his jaw working, his composure finally, completely breaking apart in a way Sophie had never witnessed from him before. She heard me, he said, his voice rough. That night, during the celebration, she heard everything I said to Owen. She did, Sophie confirmed quietly, and whatever you meant by those words, Your Grace, whatever complicated fear or duty made you say them, she believed them completely. She left because she believed you had already decided, plainly and permanently, that she meant nothing to you. Damien sat down heavily on the edge of the narrow bed, the journal still held carefully in his hands, and Sophie watched a king who had spent 10 years perfecting an expression of unshakable composure finally, completely lose that composure in front of her. Grief and guilt, and something that looked unmistakably like love, all crashing together across his face at once. I did not mean it the way it sounded, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. I said those words because I was afraid, because admitting the truth felt impossible when I was about to be bound to another woman for the sake of the kingdom's survival, because I did not believe I had any right to feel what I was feeling when duty demanded something else entirely of me. But I never stopped to consider that my fear, spoken carelessly in what I believed was a private moment, might reach her ears and convince her that she meant nothing at all, when the truth was so completely the opposite. Sophie sat down beside him, her earlier wariness softening into something closer to cautious sympathy. What is the truth, Your Grace? What do you actually feel, now that you can no longer hide behind carelessness or duty? Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the journal in his hands, at years of Elena's careful, hidden devotion recorded in ink, devotion he had never once properly seen or acknowledged while she stood right in front of him, waiting, hoping, quietly loving him without ever asking for anything in return. I think, he said finally, his voice steady, despite the emotion still evident beneath it, that I have loved her far longer than I ever allowed myself to admit, and that I was too much of a coward, too consumed by duty and fear, to recognize it until she was already gone. Sophie studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from wariness into a cautious, uncertain hope. And what do you intend to do about that, Your Grace, now that you finally understand? Damien looked up at her, and for the first time since entering the small barracks room, something resolute and unshakable settled fully into his expression, replacing every trace of the uncertainty that had plagued him for weeks. I intend to go to Fen Hollow, he said. I intend to find her, and I intend to tell her the truth, whatever the cost to the Alliance, whatever the Council demands of me. I have spent 10 years letting duty decide everything for me. I do not intend to let it decide this. Sophie's eyes widened slightly at the magnitude of what he was suggesting, the political consequences such a decision would carry, the alliance with Lady Charlotte's territory hanging delicately in the balance of an already fragile negotiation. But watching the raw determination in his expression, she found herself, despite every practical concern, hoping fiercely that he meant every word. Then you had better go quickly, Your Grace, she said, before the winter roads make the journey south impossible, and before she settles into a life that no longer has room for the possibility of you. Damien rose from the bed, the journal still held carefully in his hands, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt something other than the crushing weight of duty guiding his next steps. He felt, instead, the terrifying, exhilarating pull of a choice, made entirely for himself, and he intended, whatever it cost him, to see it through. That night, Damien summoned Owen to his study and laid out his intentions plainly, watching his oldest friend's expression shift from surprise to concern to something that eventually settled into cautious support. "You understand what you are risking," Owen said carefully. "The alliance with Lady Charlotte's territory is not yet fully secured. If word spreads that you left the kingdom to pursue a soldier from the lower quarter, weeks before your formal mating bond, the council will call it scandal. Marcus will call it disaster. I am aware of the risk," Damien said. "I have spent 10 years making every decision based on what the kingdom required of me, and I do not regret that duty, Owen. But I have just learned that my carelessness cost someone I care for deeply everything she believed she had a right to hope for, and I cannot in good conscience continue building a life on that foundation without at least attempting to make it right. And if Lady Charlotte withdraws the alliance entirely, once she learns the reason for your absence—" Damien was quiet for a moment, thinking of his conversation with Charlotte in the Frost-Hardy Gardens, her steady, perceptive gaze, her insistence on honesty over comfortable arrangement. "I do not believe she will be surprised," he said finally. "I spoke with her plainly, before I fully understood my own feelings. I believe she already suspected the truth long before I did." Owen studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, some of the concern in his expression giving way to something closer to reluctant admiration. "Then I will make the arrangements. You will need a small escort, nothing so large as to draw attention, and a cover story for the council that will hold until you return. How long do you intend to be gone?" "As long as it takes," Damien said. "I do not intend to return until I have spoken with her plainly, and heard, honestly, whatever she has to say in response." The following morning, before the winter sun had fully risen over the Eastern Kingdom, Damien met with Marcus and the council to explain, in careful, measured terms, that urgent matters required his personal attention in the Southern Territories, a diplomatic concern regarding border security that could not wait for formal channels. Marcus, ever suspicious, pressed for details Damien was not yet willing to give, but the council ultimately deferred to their king's judgment, as they had learned to do over 10 years of largely sound decisions. Only Owen and Sophie knew the true purpose of the journey, and both had sworn to keep the secret until Damien returned, whatever the outcome of his search might be. Damien packed lightly, choosing a small escort of 4 trusted guards rather than the full ceremonial procession his position typically demanded, understanding instinctively that speed and discretion mattered far more now than the formal trappings of his authority. As he rode out through the eastern gate that morning, the same gate Elena had passed through weeks before, with nothing but a single traveling bag and a heart she had hoped might finally begin to heal, Damien felt something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. A sense of purpose entirely separate from the endless demands of ruling a kingdom. For the first time in 10 years, he was riding towards something for himself alone, and whatever waited for him at the end of that southern road, he intended to face it honestly, without the armor of duty to hide behind any longer. Before he left, he sought out Lady Charlotte one final time, finding her preparing her own departure back toward the western mountain territories, her advisor Isolde already loading trunks onto a waiting carriage. He drew her aside privately, away from the ears of servants and guards, and told her plainly where he was going and why, sparing none of the truth he had finally allowed himself to accept. Charlotte listened without interruption, her expression unreadable until he finished speaking, and then she surprised him with something close to a genuine smile, the first he had seen from her since their alliance began. "I told you that you already knew the answer," she said. "I am glad you finally found the courage to act on it. For what it is worth, Damien, I do not believe our alliance needs to end because of this. There are other ways to secure the border and the trade routes that do not require either of us to sacrifice something as rare as what you appear to have found. Perhaps, when you return, we can discuss an arrangement that serves both our territories without demanding a marriage neither of us ever truly wanted." "You would do that?" Damien asked, genuinely surprised by the generosity of her offer. "I told you I valued honesty over comfortable arrangement," Charlotte said. "You have just shown me more honesty than most men manage in a lifetime. Go and find her, Damien. Fix what carelessness broke. I suspect the border negotiations will still be here when you return, and I suspect we will find a way to protect both our peoples without either of us pretending to a love neither of us feels for the other." Damien left that conversation carrying something he had not expected, a strange, lightened relief that the path ahead, however uncertain, no longer required him to choose between duty and honesty in the way he had feared. He rode south that morning with his small escort, the winter wind sharp against his face, his heart carrying a determination sharper still, and did not look back at the castle walls behind him, focused entirely on the long road ahead, and the woman waiting somewhere at the end of it, unaware that everything was about to change. News of the king's sudden departure spread through the Eastern Kingdom faster than Owen's careful cover story could contain it, and within days, the lower quarter buzzed with speculation far more accurate than anyone in the castle had anticipated. A stable hand who had overheard fragments of Owen's conversation with the escort guards mentioned it to a merchant, who mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to half the market square, and by the time the rumor reached Marcus's ears, it had already taken a shape uncomfortably close to the truth. Marcus stormed into a hastily called council session, his usually composed face flushed with barely contained frustration. "Tell me," he demanded of Owen, who remained behind to manage the kingdom's affairs in Damien's absence. "Tell me, our king has not abandoned critical border negotiations to chase after a soldier from the lower quarter." "His Grace is attending to a diplomatic matter," Owen said carefully, maintaining the cover story despite the doubt evident in every face around the council table. "The details are not mine to share. The details are precisely what this council requires," Marcus snapped. "We have an alliance half secured, a mating bond scheduled for spring, and a king who has vanished south without explanation. Do you have any understanding of what this looks like to our allies, Owen? Do you understand what it looks like to our enemies?" The question proved more prophetic than even Marcus intended. Word of the king's unexplained absence traveled beyond the Eastern Kingdom's borders within the week, carried by traders and travelers to territories that had long watched the Eastern Kingdom's strength with cautious respect, waiting for any sign of weakness that might shift the careful balance of power between the packs. The northern ranges, already responsible for the border incursion that had killed 2 scouts weeks earlier, seized on the rumor with predatory interest. A second incursion occurred within 10 days of Damien's departure, larger and more deliberate than the first. A testing probe along the northern border that resulted in the deaths of 3 more guards before the Eastern Kingdom's forces managed to repel it. Owen received the news with a sinking dread, understanding immediately that the northern packs had grown bold precisely because they believed their king had abandoned his post, distracted by matters of the heart rather than the defense of his territory. "We need him back," Owen told Sophie grimly, the two of them having formed an unlikely alliance in managing the crisis unfolding in Damien's absence. "The northern packs smell weakness, and Marcus is not wrong that this looks exactly like weakness to anyone watching from outside our borders." "He will not turn back now," Sophie said, "not when he has finally found the courage to go after her." "Then we had better hope he finds her quickly," Owen replied, "because I do not know how much longer I can hold this council together, or how much longer our borders can withstand incursions testing whether their king still cares enough to defend them." In the days following the second incursion, Marcus called an emergency session of the full council, a gathering that included not only the Eastern Kingdom's own advisors but representatives from allied territories, who had grown increasingly uneasy at reports of the king's unexplained absence. Among them was a lord from the coastal territories named Adrian Voss, a man whose alliance with the Eastern Kingdom had always been more transactional than genuine, and who saw in this moment of visible weakness an opportunity he had likely been waiting years to seize. "Perhaps," Adrian said smoothly, addressing the gathered council with the careful diplomacy of a man testing how far he could push before meeting resistance, "it is time to discuss whether the Eastern Kingdom's current leadership remains equipped to hold this alliance together. A king who abandons his post during active border incursions raises legitimate questions about priorities." The room went tense, several council members exchanging uneasy glances, and Owen felt the full weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders, understanding that whatever he said next would either hold the fragile coalition together or hand Adrian Voss the exact opening he was clearly hoping to exploit. "His Grace remains fully engaged in the defense of these borders," Owen said firmly, meeting Adrian's gaze without flinching. "The reinforcements he has ordered are already moving north, and he is committed to returning within the fortnight to personally oversee the response to these incursions. I would caution against mistaking a brief absence for abandonment, Lord Voss, particularly from a territory that has benefited considerably from this kingdom's protection over the years." The pointed reminder of the coastal territory's dependence on eastern support seemed to land, and Adrian's smooth expression flickered slightly before he inclined his head in reluctant concession. But Owen understood, watching the exchange settle uneasily around the table, that the challenge had only been deferred, not defeated, and that Damien's return within the promised fortnight had become not merely a personal matter but an urgent political necessity that could no longer be separated from whatever he found waiting for him in Fen Hollow. Meanwhile, Damien and his small escort pressed south through increasingly difficult winter terrain, unaware for several crucial days of the crisis unfolding behind him. The roads grew treacherous as snow deepened across the southern approach, and what should have been a journey of little more than a week stretched into nearly 2, as storms forced them to shelter in small villages along the way, losing precious time Damien had not accounted for in his determination to reach Elena before doubt or distance could change anything between them. It was during one such delay, sheltering in a modest inn along the southern road, that a rider from the Eastern Kingdom finally caught up with his party, carrying urgent news from Owen about the northern incursion and the mounting political pressure building in his absence. Damien read the message by firelight, his jaw tightening with each line, torn between the urgent pull toward Elena and the equally urgent demands of a kingdom that needed its king present and visible, not chasing personal matters while enemies tested weakened borders. "Your Grace," one of his escort guards said carefully, watching him wrestle visibly with the decision. "Perhaps we should return. The kingdom clearly needs you more than any personal matter can justify." Damien stared into the fire for a long moment, feeling the old, familiar pull of duty tugging at him with all its accustomed weight. For 10 years, duty had always won this particular argument, every single time, without exception. He thought of Peter's mother, of the 2 scouts who had died in the first incursion, of the 3 guards who had died in the second, deaths that had occurred, at least in part, because rumors of his absence had emboldened enemies who sensed an opportunity in his distraction. But he thought, too, of Elena's journal, of 10 years of quiet devotion he had never properly seen, of the terrible words he had spoken carelessly, that had convinced her she meant nothing to him at all. He thought of Charlotte's parting words, urging him to fix what carelessness had broken, and of his own promise to himself that he would not let duty decide everything, not this time, not when he had finally found something worth choosing for himself. "We continue south," Damien said finally, folding the message and tucking it inside his coat. "But send word back to Owen immediately. Tell him to reinforce the northern patrols with everything we can spare, and tell him I will return within the fortnight, whatever happens between now and then, to personally lead the response to these incursions myself." The compromise satisfied no one entirely, least of all Damien himself, who felt the familiar weight of divided loyalty settling heavily across his shoulders even as he pressed forward toward Fen Hollow. But he had made his choice, and he intended to see it through, understanding now, with a clarity that had eluded him for 10 years, that a king who could not also be a man capable of honest love was perhaps not fully the king his kingdom truly needed either. The remaining days of travel proved grueling, the small escort pushing their horses hard through drifted snow and biting wind, stopping only when exhaustion or darkness made continuing too dangerous. Damien slept little during those final days, his mind cycling endlessly between rehearsing what he might say to Elena and calculating how quickly he could return north once he found her, torn between 2 responsibilities that had never before, in 10 years of careful rule, demanded anything from him simultaneously. One of his escort guards, a steady young man named Caleb's distant cousin who had joined the party partway through the journey after delivering news from a neighboring village, asked him quietly one evening why a king would risk so much political stability for a single soldier from the lower quarter. "Because I spent 10 years believing duty and love could never occupy the same space," Damien answered, staring into their small campfire as snow drifted down around them. "I am no longer certain that was ever true. I think, perhaps, a king who cannot love honestly is only pretending to serve his people fully, hiding behind duty because honesty demands too much of him." The guard said nothing further, but something in his expression suggested the answer had settled somewhere meaningful, and the following morning, the small party pressed on with renewed determination, the marshlands of Fen Hollow finally coming into view against the pale winter horizon just as Damien had begun to wonder whether the journey might never end. The final approach to Fen Hollow took them through the wide river delta Elena had described in her letters to Sophie, letters Sophie had shared with Damien before his departure, giving him some sense of the landscape and the life Elena had begun building for herself in this quiet southern territory. The marshlands stretched toward a pale winter horizon, waterbirds calling across the frozen reeds, and Damien found himself, despite the urgency driving him forward, struck by the stark, quiet beauty of a place so different from the Eastern Kingdom's dense forests and rolling hills. Caleb, the pack leader of Fen Hollow, greeted the unexpected arrival of a king and his escort with cautious surprise, quickly summoning what ceremony his small settlement could manage on short notice. Damien waved away the formal greetings with an impatience that surprised even himself, focused entirely on a single question that mattered more than any diplomatic protocol. "I am looking for a soldier named Elena Ward," he said. "I understand she transferred here recently, to train your guard." Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly at the directness of the request, studying the king before him with the careful assessment of a man unaccustomed to royal visitors appearing without warning in search of a single soldier from a much larger kingdom. She has indeed a skilled trainer and a welcome addition to our guard. May I ask what business a king has with one of my soldiers, your grace? Damien hesitated, feeling the weight of everything he had traveled so far to say pressing against his chest, and found, standing there in the cold winter air of a settlement so far from everything familiar, that he no longer had the words prepared, no longer had the careful, composed speech he had practiced during the long journey south. Personal business, he said finally, that I would prefer to discuss with her directly, if you would be willing to point me toward her. Caleb studied him a moment longer, something knowing crossing his weathered face, and gestured toward the training grounds at the edge of the settlement. She is finishing the morning drills about now, your grace. Down that path past the old mill, but I will warn you, whatever business you have traveled so far to discuss, she strikes me as a woman who values honesty above grand gestures. I would choose your words carefully. Damien thanked him and turned toward the path, his heart pounding with an intensity he had not felt in years, not during battle, not during the tensest council negotiations, not even during his father's final, difficult days. He walked toward the training grounds where Elena Ward was drilling soldiers in a life she had built entirely without him, carrying 10 years of unspoken devotion, a journal full of quiet hope, and a heart he had broken without ever fully understanding what he was breaking, and prepared himself, at last, to face her honestly. Behind him, his escort remained near the settlement's central square, giving him the privacy he had requested, though he could feel their curious, hopeful attention following him nonetheless. Ahead, past the old mill Caleb had mentioned, he could already hear the distant rhythm of training drills, wooden staffs striking against practice shields, a voice calling instructions with the calm, steady authority he remembered from 100 ordinary mornings in the Eastern Kingdom's own training yard, a voice he had somehow failed to properly value until it had traveled hundreds of miles beyond his reach. He quickened his pace, snow crunching beneath his boots, the marshland wind carrying the scent of frozen reeds and distant wood smoke, and felt, for the first time since beginning this journey, that whatever waited for him at the end of this path mattered more than anything else he had ever ridden toward in his entire life as king. Elena adjusted the grip of a young recruit named Freya, correcting the girl's stance with the patient precision she had learned over 10 years of training soldiers far more experienced than the eager but unrefined guards of Fen Hollow. The morning air bit sharp and cold against her cheeks, the marshlands stretching out beyond the training grounds in a pale, frozen expanse that had become, over the past 2 months, more familiar to her than she had ever expected it could. Keep your weight balanced, Elena instructed, stepping back to observe as Freya adjusted her footing. You are trying to overpower your opponent with strength you do not yet have. Use their momentum against them instead. Freya nodded, focusing intently, and Elena felt the small, satisfying warmth of watching a student absorb a lesson properly, a feeling that had become one of the genuine joys of her new life here. She had arrived in Fen Hollow carrying grief she had not been certain she would ever fully set down, but the work had proven a steadier remedy than she had anticipated, each day filled with purpose that had nothing to do with watching a king who would never see her. She had built, in these 2 short months, something that felt entirely her own. Her small cottage near the marsh's edge had become a genuine home, filled with simple furniture she had made herself with guidance from a local carpenter, herbs drying near the window that she had learned to identify from a healer in the settlement who reminded her, in small ways, of her mother. She rose early each morning to train the guard, spent afternoons reviewing patrol routes with Caleb, and had begun, slowly, to feel less like a woman running from a broken heart, and more like a woman building a life she had chosen deliberately for herself. She still thought of Damien, of course. She was not foolish enough to believe 2 months could erase 10 years of quiet devotion entirely. But the thoughts had grown less sharp, less immediate, arriving now more like distant weather than the constant, aching presence they had once been. She wrote to Sophie regularly, careful letters that described her new life with genuine enthusiasm, though she had noticed, in Sophie's most recent reply, a strange evasiveness around certain questions about happenings back in the Eastern Kingdom, an evasiveness she had chosen not to press, assuming Sophie simply did not wish to burden her with news that might reopen old wounds. The morning drills continued for another hour, Elena moving between pairs of sparring soldiers, offering corrections, praise, occasional sharp reprimands when carelessness threatened injury. It was during this final hour, as the winter sun climbed higher over the frozen marsh, that one of the younger guards, a boy barely past his 16th year, came running from the direction of the settlement's central square, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately caught Elena's attention. "Trainer Ward," the boy called out, breathless from running. "Caleb sends word. "There is a king at the square. He is asking for you." Elena's hands went still on the practice staff she had been holding, a strange, cold certainty settling into her stomach even before she allowed herself to consciously consider who the boy might mean. There was only one king who might have any reason to travel this far south, though the very idea felt so impossible, so far outside anything she had imagined might happen, that she found herself searching for some other explanation, even as her heart began pounding with an intensity that made the cold morning air feel suddenly too thin to breathe properly. "Which king?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer with a certainty that made the question feel almost foolish. "I do not know his name, Trainer Ward. Caleb only said he was asking for you directly, by name, and that he arrived with a small escort just this morning." Elena set down the practice staff carefully, her mind racing through possibilities even as her body seemed to move on its own, dismissing the morning drills with instructions for Freya to continue the exercises without her. She could think of no reasonable explanation for why Damien Ashford would travel hundreds of miles south to a territory of no strategic significance, unless the reason had something to do with her directly, and the very possibility felt so overwhelming that she found herself frozen for a long moment, unable to decide whether to walk toward the settlement square or flee in the opposite direction entirely. She thought of the journal she had left behind in her old barracks room, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, filled with 10 years of private devotion she had never intended anyone else to read. She thought of Sophie's evasive letters, wondering now, with a sinking dread, whether her friend had somehow revealed the truth Elena had worked so carefully to keep hidden. She thought, most painfully of all, of the words she had overheard him speak to Owen during Lady Charlotte's arrival celebration, words that had convinced her, finally and completely, that whatever hope she had once carried was foolishness, deserving to be set aside. Whatever had brought Damien to Fen Hollow, she told herself, walking finally toward the path that led back to the settlement's central square, it could not undo those words. It could not erase the memory of standing at the ceremony while he exchanged formal vows with Lady Charlotte, could not erase 2 months of careful, deliberate healing she had only just begun to feel taking hold in her chest. But beneath the practical caution she tried to hold on to, something else stirred as well, something she had not expected to feel again so soon. A small, treacherous flicker of hope that refused to be fully extinguished, no matter how firmly she tried to reason it away. She quickened her pace despite herself, her heart pounding harder with every step that brought her closer to the settlement square, to whatever explanation waited there for a journey that made no sense unless it had everything to do with her. She passed the old mill, its wooden wheel frozen still in the winter cold, and rounded the final bend in the path that opened onto the settlement's central gathering space, and there, standing amid a small escort of guards she did not recognize, dressed in traveling clothes rather than the formal court attire she had always associated with him, stood Damien Ashford, looking travel-worn and uncertain in a way she had never once witnessed from him in 10 years of quiet observation. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the cold winter air stretching taut between them, filled with everything unspoken across 10 years of careful distance and 2 months of hard-won healing that suddenly felt as fragile as the thin ice forming along the marsh's frozen edges. "Elena," he said finally, his voice carrying none of the composed authority she remembered, but something rawer, more uncertain, more honestly afraid than she had ever heard from a king who had spent his entire life perfecting the appearance of unshakable control. She said nothing at first, her mind racing through every possible reason for his presence here, none of them entirely believable, all of them terrifying in their own particular way. Behind her, she was distantly aware of Caleb and several of the settlement's residents watching the scene unfold with open curiosity, understanding instinctively that whatever was happening here carried weight far beyond an ordinary diplomatic visit. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt, falling back on formal address the way she had trained herself to do for 10 years, a wall she had built without even realizing how automatically it still rose between them. "This is an unexpected distance to travel. I hope nothing is wrong in the Eastern Kingdom." Damien took a step closer, and Elena felt herself instinctively holding her ground rather than retreating, though everything in her wanted to flee back toward the safety of the training grounds, back toward the careful, ordinary life she had only just begun to build. "Something is very wrong," he said quietly, "but it has nothing to do with the kingdom's borders, and everything to do with words I spoke carelessly, months ago, without understanding that you might hear them, and without understanding, until it was already too late, exactly how false those words truly were." Elena felt her chest tighten, old wounds she had believed were healing suddenly raw and exposed again beneath the weight of his presence. "I do not think this is a conversation for the settlement square, Your Grace," she said carefully, aware of the curious eyes still watching them, of Caleb standing nearby with an expression that suggested he already understood far more than he was letting on. "You are right," Damien said. "Forgive me. I traveled so far thinking only of reaching you. I gave little thought to how this might look, arriving unannounced in front of your entire community." Elena led him away from the square, toward a quiet path along the marsh's edge where frozen reeds rattled softly in the wind, away from curious eyes, though not, she suspected, away from curious ears entirely, given how quickly news traveled in a settlement this small. She kept a careful distance between them as they walked, unwilling to let herself close the gap he had traveled hundreds of miles to close, not until she understood exactly what he wanted from her. "Why are you here?" she asked finally, when they had walked far enough that only the water birds and the wind might overhear them. "You are meant to be finalizing an alliance, preparing for a mating bond in the spring. Whatever brought you south, it must be significant enough to risk the very stability you have spent 10 years protecting." "Sophie showed me your journal," Damien said quietly, watching her face carefully as he spoke, and Elena felt the words land like a physical blow, her breath catching sharply in her throat. "She had no right," Elena said, her voice tight with something between anger and humiliation. "That was never meant for anyone else to read. I know, and I understand, if you cannot forgive her for showing me, or forgive me for reading it. But Elena, I need you to understand what reading those pages did to me. 10 years of devotion I never once properly saw, moments I had forgotten or dismissed as insignificant, and you had carried them so carefully, for so long, while I built an entire life around the assumption that duty and personal happiness could never occupy the same space." Elena stared out at the frozen marsh, unable to meet his eyes, her mind cycling through everything she had overheard that night during the celebration, words that had convinced her so completely that whatever she felt meant nothing to him. "You told Owen I was foolishness," she said quietly. "A passing curiosity, already set aside. I heard you say it, Your Grace, with my own ears. Not through some journal Sophie should never have shared." Damien's expression crumpled slightly at this, guilt and grief warring plainly across his features. "I know. I have relived those words 100 times since learning you heard them. I said them because I was afraid, Elena. Afraid of what it would mean to admit, on the eve of a political alliance I believed necessary for the kingdom's survival, that I had begun to feel something for you I had no right to feel given everything duty demanded of me. I convinced myself that dismissing it, even cruelly, even carelessly, was safer than confronting a truth I was not ready to face. I never imagined you might be close enough to hear it, and I certainly never imagined that hearing it would drive you to leave everything you knew." "So you traveled all this way to apologize for careless words," Elena said, though even as she spoke she could feel the careful walls she had built over 2 months of healing beginning, treacherously, to crack. "I traveled all this way," Damien said, closing the remaining distance between them despite her earlier retreat, "because I have finally understood that those words were a lie. Elena, the biggest lie I have ever told, and I could not continue building a life on that lie without at least attempting to tell you the truth. Whatever the cost to the alliance, whatever the council demands of me when I return. I love you. I do not know exactly when it began, whether it was a hay bale and honey bread when we were children, or your wrapped wrist weeks before Charlotte's arrival, or the 10 years of quiet, steady devotion I never once properly acknowledged. But I know it now, fully and without doubt, and I could not let you build an entire life hundreds of miles away believing I felt nothing at all, when the truth has always been the opposite." The wind carried his words out across the frozen marsh, and Elena stood very still, feeling 10 years of careful, guarded hope colliding directly with 2 months of hard-won healing, uncertain, for the first time since arriving in Fen Hollow, which of those two truths she was meant to trust. Elena took a step back from him, needing distance to think clearly, the frozen reeds crunching softly beneath her boots. Everything she had built over the past 2 months, every careful piece of a new life she had constructed from the wreckage of 10 years of silent devotion, suddenly felt precarious, threatened by the very thing she had once wanted more than anything else in the world. "You cannot simply arrive here," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "After 10 years of never truly seeing me, after standing at a ceremony exchanging vows with another woman, after telling your most trusted friend that I was nothing more than foolishness, and expect those words to undo everything I have finally begun to heal from." "I do not expect anything from you," Damien said, his own voice carrying a rawness she had never once witnessed from him. "I have no right to expect forgiveness, or a return to the Eastern Kingdom, or anything at all beyond the chance to tell you the truth honestly, for the first time, instead of hiding behind careless words meant to protect myself from feelings I was too afraid to face. Whatever you decide after hearing that truth, I will accept it, though it will break something in me that I am not certain will ever fully heal. And what of Lady Charlotte? Elena demanded, the question surfacing before she could stop it. 10 years of watching him from the edges of his world finally finding its voice in this one unguarded moment. What of the alliance, the mating bond, the borders you have spent your entire reign protecting? Am I meant to believe you would truly abandon all of that? For me? I already spoke with Charlotte before I left, Damien said. She understood, perhaps better than I did myself, exactly what I was feeling before I found the courage to admit it. She offered to renegotiate the alliance without the marriage, to find another arrangement that serves both our territories honestly, without either of us pretending to a love we do not feel for one another. Whatever happens between us, Elena, the kingdom's safety does not depend on me marrying a woman I do not love. It never truly did. I simply believed, for 10 years, that duty required me to sacrifice every personal happiness in its name, and I am only now beginning to understand how wrong that belief always was. Elena felt something in her chest crack open at this, the careful anger she had been holding on to giving way, slowly, to something rawer and more complicated underneath. She thought of her mother's words about building a life more real than the one left behind, of Sophie's tearful farewell, of 2 months spent training soldiers in a settlement that had, despite everything, begun to feel genuinely like home. She thought, too, of 10 years spent hoping for exactly this moment, exactly these words, spoken honestly rather than overheard carelessly through a half-open door. You broke something in me, she said quietly, tears finally rising in her eyes despite her best efforts to hold them back. Do you understand that, Damien? Not just the words you spoke to Owen, but 10 years of watching you kneel beside my wrist for 4 seconds and walk away without a second glance. 10 years of hoping for something I convinced myself I had no right to want. I built a life here specifically because I could no longer bear carrying that hope. And now you are standing here asking me to believe it was never foolish at all, and I do not know how to hold both of those truths at once. Damien closed the remaining distance between them, and this time Elena did not step back, though she remained rigid, uncertain, torn between the careful walls of self-protection she had spent 2 months constructing, and the treacherous, overwhelming hope that had never fully died, despite every reasonable effort to extinguish it. I am not asking you to forget the pain I caused you, he said softly. I am not even asking you to return with me today, or ever, if that is not what you want. I am only asking you to let me tell you the truth, honestly and completely, so that whatever you decide it knowing exactly how I feel, rather than believing the lie I told out of fear. I love you, Elena Ward. I think I have loved you for years without allowing myself to properly understand it, hidden beneath duty and responsibility, and the careful composure I believed a king required of himself at all times. I was wrong to hide it. I was wrong to dismiss you so carelessly that night, and I will carry the weight of that mistake for the rest of my life, whether or not you ever forgive me for it. Elena stood very still, the wind carrying his words out across the frozen marsh, and felt, for the first time in 2 months, the full weight of everything she had run from finally catching up to her, not as a burden this time, but as something she had to actually face rather than simply escape. I need time, she said finally, her voice steadier now, though tears still traced silently down her cheeks. You cannot arrive here after 10 years of silence and expect me to simply fall back into your arms because you have finally found the words I always hoped to hear. I built something here, Damien, something that is mine, that exists entirely separate from you, and I am not willing to abandon it on the strength of a single conversation, however honest. I understand, Damien said, and Elena could see in his expression that he genuinely meant it, that whatever hope had brought him hundreds of miles south, he was prepared to accept whatever answer she needed to give, on whatever timeline she needed to give it. I will not push you for more than you are willing to offer. I only ask that you allow me to stay in Fen Hollow for a few days, to prove through my actions rather than my words alone that this is not some passing whim I will abandon once the difficulty of the choice becomes clear. And then, whatever you decide, I will accept it and return north to face the consequences of this journey, whatever they may be. Elena studied him for a long moment, this man she had loved quietly for 10 years, standing before her now travel-worn and honest, in a way she had never once witnessed from him, stripped of the careful composure that had always kept her at a careful, respectful distance. She thought of everything Sophie's letters had hinted at but never fully explained, of the political risk he had clearly taken in traveling here at all, of the genuine vulnerability evident in every word he had spoken since arriving. A few days, she said finally, and nothing more, until I have had time to think clearly about what I actually want, separate from 10 years of hope and 2 months of hard-won healing and whatever feelings your presence here has stirred back to the surface. A few days, Damien agreed. That is more than I had any right to hope for. They stood together at the edge of the frozen marsh for a long moment longer, neither one moving to close the remaining distance between them, both understanding that whatever came next would require patience. Neither of them had ever been particularly skilled at offering. But something had shifted in the space between them. Something that had been buried for 10 years finally brought into the open air, and as they walked back together toward the settlement, careful distance still maintained between them, Elena found herself, despite every reasonable caution, allowing herself to hope again, just slightly, that this time the hope might not prove foolish after all. That evening, word of the king's arrival and his purpose had spread through Fen Hollow entirely, and Caleb approached Elena privately as she finished the evening's final duties, his expression carrying a careful curiosity he clearly felt entitled to given the disruption to his small settlement. A king traveling hundreds of miles for a soldier, Caleb said. That is not something I have witnessed in 20 years of leading this pack. Whatever you decide, Elena, know that you have built something valuable here, and Fen Hollow would be glad to keep you, kingdom or no kingdom. Thank you, Caleb, Elena said quietly. I do not yet know what I will decide. But walking back to her small cottage that evening, the marshland stars scattered brilliantly overhead in the clear winter sky, Elena found herself thinking, for the first time in 2 months, not of the pain she had carried away from the Eastern Kingdom, but of the boy who had once shared honey bread with a hiding girl, and the man who had just traveled hundreds of miles to tell her, honestly and completely, exactly how much that quiet, hidden devotion had actually meant. The following days passed slowly, carefully, both of them navigating the strange new territory of honesty after so many years of silence and distance. Damien did not simply wait idle in Fen Hollow, expecting his presence alone to prove his sincerity. He rose each morning before the sun, joining the settlement's guard for training, working alongside soldiers who had no idea, at first, that the travel-worn man training beside them was a king, until word inevitably spread and the recruits began treating him with a nervous, uncertain respect that he waved away with genuine humility, insisting on being treated as simply another pair of hands willing to help. He helped repair a section of fencing near the marsh's edge that had been damaged by winter storms, working alongside Caleb and 2 other settlement residents without complaint, despite the cold and the unfamiliar labor. He visited the small healer's cottage where Elena had learned to identify drying herbs, listening attentively as the elderly healer explained remedies he had never once had reason to learn about during his years of ruling from behind castle walls. Elena watched all of this from a careful distance, uncertain what to make of a king who seemed genuinely willing to set aside every trapping of his position simply to prove that his feelings for her extended beyond words alone. On the 3rd evening, she found him sitting alone near the frozen marsh, watching the sunset paint the winter sky in shades of orange and violet, and she sat beside him without quite deciding to, the careful distance she had maintained for days suddenly feeling less necessary than it had before. You do not have to keep proving yourself, she said quietly. I already believe you meant what you said. Then why do you still keep your distance? Damien asked, not accusingly, simply curious, watching her with the same careful attention he had shown throughout his entire visit. Because believing you meant it and knowing what to do about it are 2 very different things, Elena admitted. I spent 10 years building my entire sense of hope around glimpses of you I collected like treasures, and 2 months learning that I could build an entire life without needing those glimpses at all. I do not know how to combine those 2 versions of myself, Damien, the one who loved you quietly for a decade, and the one who finally learned to stop. Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully before responding. Perhaps you do not need to combine them, he said finally. Perhaps the woman who learned to build a life without me is exactly the woman I need beside me now, not the girl who once hid behind a hay bale hoping for scraps of attention. I do not want you to return to the Eastern Kingdom because you cannot survive without me, Elena. I want you to return, if you choose to, because you have built enough strength and clarity here to choose me freely, as an equal, not out of the old hope that once made you feel small. Elena felt something in her chest loosen slightly at this, an understanding she had not expected him to reach so quickly, given how little practice he had ever had with this kind of honest, vulnerable conversation. That is a generous way to think about it, she said softly. It is the only way I know how to think about it now, Damien replied. Reading your journal taught me more than I ever expected, not just how deeply you loved me, but how much of yourself you sacrificed to keep that love quiet and small, believing it had to stay that size in order to survive. I do not want that kind of love from you anymore, Elena. I want the kind that takes up space, that demands to be seen, that does not have to hide behind hay bales or half-open doors. They sat together in silence as the sunset faded fully into darkness, the marsh stars beginning their slow climb across the clear winter sky, and Elena found herself, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely uncertain whether the careful distance she had maintained for 3 days still served any purpose at all. It was on the 4th morning that a rider arrived from the Eastern Kingdom, exhausted from hard travel, carrying urgent news that would force Elena's careful deliberation into something far more immediate than either of them had anticipated. The rider, one of Owen's most trusted guards, delivered his message with the breathless urgency of a man who had ridden through the night without rest. Damien read the letter standing in the settlement square, Elena beside him, Caleb and several curious residents watching from a respectful distance, and felt his stomach drop as he absorbed the full weight of what Owen had written. The Northern Pax had launched a 3rd incursion, larger and more coordinated than the previous 2, testing the eastern border with a force that suggested careful planning, rather than opportunistic probing. Meanwhile, Lord Adrian Voss had used the king's continued absence to press his earlier concerns further, convincing 2 smaller allied territories to withdraw their support, pending clarity on the Eastern Kingdom's leadership. Marcus, though he had held the council together as best he could, warned plainly that Damien's return could not wait any longer, without risking irreparable damage to the fragile coalition his father and grandfather had spent generations building. "I have to return immediately," Damien said, refolding the letter with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady. "Whatever remains unresolved between us, Elena, my kingdom needs me now more urgently than I can afford to ignore." Elena studied his face, understanding immediately the full weight of what he was facing, the very real consequences of a choice he had made for himself finally colliding with the duty he had spent 10 years placing above everything else. "Then you should go," she said. "Immediately. I will not be the reason your kingdom suffers, Damien, whatever we have or have not resolved between us." "Come with me," Damien said suddenly, the words arriving before he had fully considered them. Though once spoken, he found he meant them completely. "Not because I am asking you to abandon what you have built here, and not because I expect an answer to everything unresolved between us, but because whatever happens next, whether these incursions test my ability to hold the kingdom together, whether Marcus and the council question my judgment, I would rather face it with you beside me than without you, in whatever capacity you are willing to offer." Elena hesitated, torn between the life she had built in Fen Hollow and the pull of a kingdom in crisis. A man who had finally spoken the truth she had waited 10 years to hear. She thought of Caleb's words, that Fen Hollow would be glad to keep her regardless of kingdom or crown. And she thought, too, of her mother's insistence that leaving was sometimes the only way to discover what you were truly capable of building. She had already proven she could build a life without him. Perhaps now the question was not whether she could survive without him, but whether she wanted to choose him freely, as her own woman rather than a hopeful girl hiding behind a hay bale. "I will come," she said finally, "not as your soldier returning to duty, and not as a woman desperate for your attention after 10 years of silence. I will come, because I choose to, freely, and because whatever happens with the northern incursions and the council's doubts, I want to see how this ends, for both of us." They rode north within the hour, Damien's small escort joined now by Elena, who insisted on bringing her full guard training and none of her old uncertainty, and the journey back proved faster than the journey south had been, urgency lending speed to horses and riders alike. They arrived at the Eastern Kingdom's gates 4 days later, travel-worn and exhausted, to find the castle already gathered in tense anticipation of their king's return. Owen met them at the gate, relief evident on his weathered face, though his expression carried the strain of weeks spent managing a crisis that had only grown more complicated in Damien's absence. "The northern forces have retreated for now," he reported quickly, but only after significant losses on both sides. "Marcus has called a full council session, and Lord Voss has brought representatives from 2 allied territories demanding answers about your leadership." Damien nodded grimly, already shifting fully into the composed, decisive bearing Elena remembered from 10 years of quiet observation, though she noticed now, watching him prepare to face the council, something different beneath that composure, an honesty that had not been there before his journey south. The council session that followed proved the most difficult of Damien's entire reign. Marcus pressed hard, demanding explanations for the king's unexplained absence during active border incursions, and Lord Adrian Voss, seizing his opportunity fully, argued openly that the Eastern Kingdom's leadership had proven itself distracted and unreliable, suggesting that allied territories might need to reconsider the terms of their support going forward. Damien listened to every accusation without flinching, and when his turn came to respond, he did something none of the assembled council members expected. Rather than offering the careful, diplomatic explanations that had always characterized his rule, He told them the truth, plainly and completely, about 10 years of quiet devotion he had failed to recognize, about words spoken carelessly that had driven away a woman he loved, about a journey south taken not out of weakness, but out of a hard-won understanding, that a king who could not be honest with himself could never truly serve his people well either. "I do not regret the journey," Damien said, his voice carrying steady conviction across the council chamber. "I regret that my absence coincided with an enemy's opportunity, and I take full responsibility for the losses suffered during these incursions. But I will not apologize for choosing, finally, to be honest about my own heart, and I will not pretend that a kingdom led by a man too afraid to face his own truth is somehow stronger than one led by a man willing to face it, however costly that honesty proves to be." The chamber fell silent, several council members exchanging uncertain glances, and Lord Adrian Voss, sensing the shifting mood of the room, pressed his advantage once more. "Pretty words, Your Grace, but they do not repair broken alliances, or replace fallen soldiers. Perhaps it is time this council considered whether your priorities remain aligned with the kingdom's genuine needs." It was Lady Charlotte, arriving unexpectedly at the council chamber doors at that exact moment, having traveled from the Western Mountain Territories upon hearing word of the crisis, who finally shifted the balance of the room entirely. She entered with the same commanding presence Elena remembered from the alliance ceremony months earlier, and addressed the assembled council directly. "I have come to clarify the terms of my territory's alliance with the Eastern Kingdom," Charlotte announced, "since Lord Voss seems so eager to question its stability. My mountain forces remain fully committed to supporting these borders, mating bond or no mating bond, because I have found in Damien Ashford a king who values honesty over convenient arrangement, and I would rather ally myself with such a man than with territories who abandon their commitments the moment convenience shifts elsewhere." The pointed reference to Lord Voss's own wavering loyalty landed exactly as intended, and several council members shifted uncomfortably, understanding now that Charlotte's continued support undercut the entire foundation of Voss's argument. Marcus, ever pragmatic, recognized the shifting tide and redirected the conversation toward practical matters of border reinforcement rather than continued questioning of the king's judgment, and within the hour, the immediate political crisis had begun, slowly, to resolve itself. After the council session ended, Damien found a quiet moment to speak with Charlotte privately, gratitude evident in every word as he thanked her for the timing and force of her intervention. Charlotte waved away his thanks with characteristic directness. "I did not do it purely for your sake, Damien," she said. "I meant what I told the council. I would rather ally myself with honesty than convenience, and Lord Voss has always struck me as a man who values his own position over any genuine loyalty. But I will admit, seeing you finally choose something for yourself, after months of watching you carry duty like a burden you were never allowed to set down, gave me a measure of hope for what kind of king you might become once you learn to trust your own heart alongside your judgment." "What will you do now?" Damien asked. "About the alliance, about your own territory's needs." "I will return home and continue ruling my mountain passes as I always have," Charlotte said. "Perhaps, in time, I will find someone who wants to build something honest with me, the way you have found with your soldier. Until then, I am content to be your ally rather than your wife, and I suspect that arrangement will serve both our territories far better than the one the council originally intended." Their conversation ended with a mutual respect that had not existed at the start of their arranged alliance, and in the months that followed, the trade and defense agreement Damien negotiated with Charlotte's territory proved every bit as strong as the original marriage contract had promised, built now on genuine partnership rather than obligation. In the weeks that followed, Damien worked tirelessly to repair what the crisis had damaged, reinforcing the northern border with additional patrols, personally visiting the families of soldiers lost during the incursions, and negotiating new terms with Charlotte's territory that secured the alliance through trade and mutual defense, rather than a marriage neither of them had ever wanted. Lord Adrian Voss, finding his opportunity fully closed, withdrew his challenge quietly, understanding that the coalition Damien had rebuilt now stood stronger and more genuinely committed than before. Elena, for her part, returned to the Eastern Kingdom's guard, though not to her old position among the ranks. Instead, she took on a role training soldiers directly under Owen's command, bringing the skills she had honed in Fen Hollow back to the kingdom that had once overlooked her so completely. She and Damien did not rush into anything, both understanding that 10 years of silence and months of separation required patience rather than immediate resolution. But they spent time together honestly now, in the training yard, in quiet evening conversations, in small moments that finally allowed them to know each other as they truly were, rather than as distant glimpses across a careful divide. Sophie welcomed Elena back with fierce, tearful joy, and Grace and Henry received the news of their daughter's return with quiet pride, understanding that whatever came next for Elena, she had returned not as the woman who had fled a decade of silent longing, but as someone who had built her own strength first, and chosen love freely, only after learning she did not need it to survive. Spring arrived gently over the Eastern Kingdom that year, the frost finally melting from the training yards and gardens, and on a quiet morning in the castle grounds, Damien found Elena exactly where he had found her months before, sitting on the low stone wall behind the training barracks, watching the sunrise instead of a lit window she could never step into. He sat beside her without a word, and for a long moment, they simply watched the light spread slowly across the kingdom together. No careful distance between them now, no 10 years of hidden hope, only the quiet, steady presence of two people who had finally learned to see each other honestly, after everything it had cost them to get there. "I used to sit here and watch your window," Elena said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "wondering if you would ever look back." "I am looking now," Damien said simply, taking her hand in his, and this time, he did not let go. The kingdom, in time, came to know the story of their king's journey south, though the details softened with retelling, becoming something closer to legend than history, a tale passed down through the lower quarter, about a soldier who loved quietly for years, and a king who turned his entire world upside down to find her. But Elena and Damien knew the truth of it best, that love built on honesty, however delayed, however costly to reach, proved stronger and more lasting than any silence, however carefully kept, could ever have allowed it to become. Sophie married a soldier from the coastal patrol later that year, and Elena stood beside her as she had always promised she would, watching her closest friend build her own happiness with the same fierce loyalty Sophie had shown her through 10 difficult years of quiet longing. Owen continued serving as Damien's most trusted advisor, though he never let his king forget, with a teasing familiarity earned through decades of friendship, how close Damien had come to losing everything, by waiting so long to speak his heart honestly. Elena's parents visited the castle for the first time that autumn, Henry marveling at the great forges that supplied the kingdom's weapons, Grace exchanging remedies and stories with the castle healers late into the evening, watching her parents walk the halls she had once wandered as a lonely soldier hiding her feelings behind careful silence. Elena felt a fullness in her chest that 10 years of quiet devotion had never once allowed her to feel. The northern border, reinforced and carefully watched, saw no further incursions that year, the packs beyond the ranges apparently satisfied that whatever weakness they had sensed in the king's brief absence had proven, in the end, entirely temporary. Lord Adrian Voss quietly rebuilt his standing with the council through smaller, steadier acts of cooperation, having learned that opportunism carried its own long-term costs when the coalition it targeted ultimately proved stronger than expected. As for Elena and Damien, their story continued slowly, honestly, built day by day on conversations neither of them had ever allowed themselves before, on small kindnesses finally spoken aloud rather than carried silently, on a partnership that neither duty nor distance could easily unravel again. What began as 10 years of quiet watching from a stone wall, and a kingdom turned briefly upside down by a king's desperate search, settled at last into something steadier, and more lasting than either of them had ever quite dared to imagine. A love chosen freely, by two people who had each, in their own way, finally learned what it meant to be truly seen.